Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Oliver Hayes had learned to trust the cold that settled in his joints before storms. The way his teeth ached when standing near places where people had died. The prickling along his scalp that meant something was watching. 38 years of ignoring doctors who prescribed antipsychotics, of nodding through conversations about heightened pattern recognition and sensory processing differences, had taught him that some truths existed outside the vocabulary of rational minds. The wilderness threshold of Glacier National Park pressed against him like a physical weight as he stepped out of his Forest Service truck at the Many Glacier Ranger Station. September 2014 had arrived with teeth, early snow dusting the peaks above 10,000 feet, aspens bleeding gold into the valleys below. His Garmin Montana 600 GPS unit showed the Iceberg Lake trailhead coordinates, but the device felt heavier than its 7 ounces, as if gravity worked differently here. You're the sensitive one. District Ranger Patricia Moreno didn't make it sound like a compliment. She was 52, built like a fire hydrant, with eyes that had seen too many body recoveries to waste time on pleasantries. That's what Denver said when they assigned you. Oliver adjusted the Motorola radio on his belt. They said you needed someone familiar with difficult searches. Difficult. Patricia's laugh came out sharp. Charlotte Morrison has been missing for 72 hours. Experienced backcountry researcher, PhD candidate studying high-altitude lichen patterns. She knew these mountains. Her spot tracker went dead at 2:47 p.m. 3 days ago, right around Iceberg Lake. We've had 2 SAR teams sweep the standard search radius. Nothing. Not a boot print, not a torn piece of clothing, not a single goddamn clue. The wrongness Oliver had felt since crossing into the park intensified. It wasn't the normal absence of person static he'd learned to read on searches. This was active, deliberate, like standing in a room where someone had just stopped breathing, where the silence itself had intention. The Blackfeet Rangers won't go past Ptarmigan Falls, Patricia continued, pulling out a topographical map weathered by countless field deployments. They're saying things I don't have words for in their language, words that don't translate nice. Oliver traced the trail route with his finger, feeling the paper's texture change where her last known position was marked. The sensation that crawled up his arm made him want to wash his hands. What kind of words? The kind that make men who've worked these mountains for 40 years refuse overtime. Patricia's jaw tightened. I need someone who won't spook, someone who can feel things others miss. That's you, right? That's your gift? Gift. Oliver had never called it that. Curse, maybe. Burden. The thing that made him wake up screaming from dreams that later played out in waking life. The reason his ex-wife had taken their daughter to Seattle and changed their number. The sensitivity that let him find the missing, but never soon enough to find them alive. I'll need Charlotte's personal effects, he said, something she wore frequently. Patricia handed him a Ziploc bag containing a fleece jacket. The moment Oliver's fingers touched the fabric through the plastic, Charlotte Morrison became real to him. Not just a name on a missing person report, but a presence. 26 years old, vegetarian, afraid of her father's disappointment, in love with a man she'd never told, fascinated by the way life persisted in impossible places. And underneath all of that, terror so pure it had soaked into the synthetic fibers like sweat. She was running from something, Oliver said softly. Running from what, a bear? The weather? Something that shouldn't exist. Patricia's expression hardened into the mask of someone who'd decided he was crazy but useful. Get me answers, Hayes. Real ones. I've got her parents flying in from Boston tomorrow, and I won't tell them their daughter got eaten because my ranger felt bad vibes. The Iceberg Lake Trail began innocuously enough. A well-maintained path through subalpine forest, marked with standard NPS brown signs warning about bear safety and weather preparedness. Oliver moved through lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce with his pack rattling softly, rope, first aid kit, emergency bivvy, water purification tablets, and the items he never logged on equipment manifests. Salt in a plastic bottle, silver religious medals from 3 different faiths, tobacco in a leather pouch. Things that made sense only when the world revealed its other face. His GPS showed he was making good time, 3 miles per hour on relatively flat terrain. The device's backlit screen cast a faint glow in the dimming afternoon light, showing elevation gain from 4,800 feet at the trailhead toward the lake's 6,100-foot basin. But the numbers felt wrong, misaligned with the landscape they supposedly described. At Ptarmigan Falls, where cascading water had carved amphitheaters into ancient stone, Oliver found the first sign. Not a sign Charlotte had passed this way, a sign that something else had. The tracks pressed into mud near the water's edge began as wolf prints, large, perhaps 80 pounds, moving with purpose. Oliver crouched, studying the gait pattern with the thoroughness his training had drilled into him. 4 paw prints, then 3. Then something that looked like a boot tread but stretched 7 inches too long. Then back to wolf prints, but now pointing the wrong direction, as if the creature had reversed its skeletal structure mid-stride. The cold settled into his joints. His teeth began to ache. "No," he whispered to the forest. "Not that. Please, not that." But the forest wasn't listening, or it was listening too closely. The sound of water over rock had developed harmonics that shouldn't exist in nature, patterns that almost resolved into syllables. Oliver forced himself to stand, to key his radio, to follow protocol even as his hindbrain screamed warnings in the language of prey animals. "Base, this is Hayes. Reached Ptarmigan Falls. I'm continuing to Iceberg Lake. Weather looks questionable. Over." Static answered. Then Patricia's voice distorted. "Copy that, Hayes. Storm system moving in faster than predicted. You've got maybe 4 hours before it hits. Find something or get back down." 4 hours. The tracks led deeper into wilderness where the trail narrowed, where the forest pressed closer, where the last cell tower signal had died miles ago. Oliver clicked on his headlamp, a Princeton Tech Apex with 200 lumens that suddenly felt inadequate against the gathering dusk. The beam caught movement in his peripheral vision. When he snapped his head toward it, there was only a Douglas fir, branches swaying in wind he couldn't feel. The sensitivity that had plagued him since childhood sharpened into something almost unbearable. He could feel the weight of attention, vast and inhuman, settling onto him like a physical pressure. Something was pacing him through the trees, staying just beyond sight, studying him with an intelligence that made his stomach clench. At the trail junction, where a wooden sign pointed toward Iceberg Lake, 2.4 miles, Oliver found Charlotte's backpack. It sat in the exact center of the trail, positioned with geometric precision that natural abandonment never achieved. No sign of struggle, no scattered contents, just a blue Osprey Aura 65, neatly placed, as if she'd set it down to rest and simply walked away from her entire life. Oliver's hand shook as he opened it, inventorying contents with practiced efficiency. Water bottles full, energy bars uneaten, lichen samples in labeled containers, field notebook with entries dated through 3 days ago, handwriting steady and unremarkable. Nothing that suggested panic or pursuit. The last entry read, "Unusual animal vocalizations near tree line. Coyote, wolf. Recording didn't capture it properly. We'll investigate further." There was no recording device in the pack. The sensitivity struck him like a migraine, sudden and disorienting. Oliver staggered, bracing himself against a tree as images cascaded through his mind, not his memories but Charlotte's, somehow imprinted on the objects she'd touched. He saw through her eyes, something moving between aspens at twilight, too large for a coyote, too fluid for a bear. Saw her raise her phone to record it, saw the thing turn toward her and its eyes caught the dying light, reflecting not the green eyeshine of normal animals but a flat, wrong luminescence that looked almost like human eyes in a wolf's skull, rotating as the bone structure beneath the fur shifted, joints bending backward, forward, sideways in anatomically impossible configurations. Oliver's lunch came up in a hot rush. He vomited into the brush, spitting bile, trying to clear the afterimage of those eyes from his mind. The eyes that had known Charlotte was watching, that had wanted her to know what she was seeing, that had smiled at her with a wolf's jaws full of teeth too straight, too white, too human. When he could breathe again, he keyed his radio with trembling fingers. "Base, this is Hayes. Found Morrison's pack at the Iceberg Junction. No sign of her. Evidence suggests contact with wildlife." "Copy. Describe the evidence." Oliver looked at the tracks circling the abandoned backpack. They changed from wolf to elk to mountain lion to something with opposable thumbs that left handprints in the dirt. Handprints with too many joints in the fingers. "Inconclusive," he lied. "Requesting permission to continue to Iceberg Lake. She might have made it to the basin." The static lasted too long, then. "Negative, Hayes. Storm's accelerating. You need to return now. That's an order." But Oliver was already moving deeper into the wilderness, following the tracks that shouldn't exist because he could feel Charlotte Morrison's terror like a beacon, and because he'd learned long ago that orders meant nothing when you could sense the screaming of the almost dead. The forest changed as he climbed. Trees grew sparse, wind tortured into stunted forms. The trail became scree and loose rock, treacherous in the fading light. His headlamp beam caught movement again, a shape that might have been a person, standing motionless 300 yards upslope, watching him struggle upward. "Charlotte." His voice echoed off stone amphitheaters, returning to him distorted. "Charlotte Morrison." The figure tilted its head at an angle no human cervical spine should permit. Then it dropped to all fours and loped away with a wolf's efficient gait, except it was wearing clothes. He could see the flap of fabric, the flash of what might have been a hiking boot. Oliver's Garmin showed he was at 5,900 feet, approaching the lake basin. Temperature had dropped to 41 degrees. The wind carried the smell of approaching snow and something else, something organic and wrong, like rot disguised as musk. His radio crackled with Patricia's increasingly urgent demands that he return to the trailhead. But her voice was breaking up, syllables fragmenting into something that almost sounded like words in a language he didn't know. He switched the radio off. The lake appeared suddenly as he crested the final moraine, a dark mirror of water reflecting the last purple light of dusk, surrounded by cirque walls that rose toward Iceberg Peak's 9,080-foot summit. Chunks of glacial ice floated near the shore, grinding together with sounds like teeth. And on the far side of the lake, barely visible in the gathering darkness, a figure stood at the water's edge. Oliver's entire body locked up. His sensitivity went from migraine to full synaptic overload. Every nerve ending firing warnings that this was wrong, fundamentally wrong, that he was seeing something reality itself rejected. The figure was tall, too tall, proportioned like a human stretched on a rack. It wore what might have been Charlotte Morrison's clothing, her plaid shirt, her hiking pants, but the fabric hung wrong, as if the thing inside the clothes had too many joints, too many places where bone could hinge and fold. As he watched, frozen in animal terror, the figure raised its arms. The sleeves fell back, revealing hands that shifted as he looked at them. Human fingers elongating into wolf claws, fur sprouting and receding in waves, the bones restructuring themselves with wet sounds that carried across the still water. Then it spoke. Oliver Hayes. Charlotte Morrison's voice came from the thing's throat, perfect in every detail. Her Boston accent, her slight lisp on sibilance, the warmth she'd carried in every recording her family had provided. "Took you long enough." His mouth had gone dry. Words came out cracked. "Where is she?" "Where is who?" The thing wearing Charlotte's voice tilted its head, and in the beam of his headlamp, Oliver saw that the neck kept tilting, rotating a full 180 degrees until the face was upside down, still smiling. "I'm right here, can't you see me? You're not Charlotte Morrison." The smile widened, showing teeth that were wolf fangs one moment, human incisors the next, switching back and forth in a nauseating strobe. "How would you know? You never met her. For all your sensitivity, Oliver, you can only feel the echoes of people. You've never actually seen the truth." Thunder rolled across the peaks. The first drops of freezing rain began to fall, stippling the lake surface. Oliver's headlamp flickered and he smacked it with his palm, terror spiking as the light steadied. Darkness here would be death. He understood that with certainty. "The Blackfeet won't speak your name," Oliver said, forcing his voice steady. "But I will, ye Naldlushi, skinwalker. You violated the sacred, wore the skins of the dead, practiced the witchcraft that corrupts. You're not supposed to be this far north. This isn't your territory." The thing laughed, a sound that started as Charlotte Morrison's giggle and descended into wolf howls, coyote yips, the scream of a mountain lion, all layered over each other. "Supposed to? You think there are borders for what I am? I go where the skins take me, Oliver, and these mountains have so many skins. So many people walking trails alone, thinking they're safe because they know the names of trees." It began walking toward him around the lake's edge, and Oliver saw that its gait was wrong. Not quite bipedal, not quite quadrupedal, but some stomach-turning compromise between the two. Each step it took left different tracks. Boot prints, paw prints, hoof prints, something that might have been a bear but with toes arranged in a pentagram pattern. "What did you do to Charlotte Morrison?" Gave her a choice. The thing stopped, and its form seemed to solidify slightly. More human now, but human in a way that made Oliver's eyes water, as if he was seeing too many versions of humanity stacked on top of each other. She could run, and I would chase, or she could stay, and I would teach her the old ways, the ways that let you slip out of your skin and into another, to see the world through different eyes, to taste the freedom of being predator instead of prey. She refused. She ran. The smile returned, and this time it was purely predatory. For almost 6 hours she ran. Impressive, really. Her heart was very strong, very fast. I could hear it from miles away, getting weaker but never stopping. She had such determination. Oliver's hand moved to his pack, fingers finding the plastic bottle of salt. "Where is her body?" "Body?" The skinwalker cocked its head, and the gesture was so perfectly human, so precisely Charlotte Morrison's mannerism from the video her parents had shared, that Oliver's gorge rose again. "What makes you think there's a body left?" "When we wear a skin, Oliver, we wear it completely. Every cell, every memory, every fear." The implication hit him like a physical blow. "You consumed her. I became her. There's a difference." The thing spread its arms wide, and for a moment Oliver saw the truth of it, saw the way the skinwalker existed in a space between forms, neither human nor animal, but something that could flow between states like water. "And now I understand why Denver sent you here. You can feel me, can't you? Really feel me. You know what I am in ways others never could." The sensitivity that had guided Oliver to Charlotte's location was now screaming warnings. The skinwalker was circling, positioning itself between him and the trail down. Storm clouds had rolled in fully now, obscuring the last light, turning the world into shapes and shadows. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the creature in freeze-frame horror, there for an instant in its true form. Something that was all teeth and too many limbs, wearing Charlotte Morrison's skin like an inadequate disguise. "That's why you're here," Oliver said, understanding crystallizing into dread. "Not for Charlotte, for me." "Smart." The skinwalker grinned. Charlotte Morrison was bait, adequate bait, but bait nonetheless. You, though, Oliver Hayes, the sensitive one, the man who walks between the real and the impossible. You would be so much more useful. Imagine what I could do with your gift. Imagine how many skins I could wear, how perfectly I could mimic humanity, if I had your ability to feel the inner truth of people. The salt bottle was in his hand now. The silver medals, tobacco pouch. Objects that held power only if he believed they did. If generations of humans believing before him had worn channels into reality itself. Oliver had spent his life doubting his own perceptions, being told his sensitivity was delusion, his visions were hallucinations. But here, in the dark basin beneath Iceberg Peak, doubt was a luxury he couldn't afford. "I won't let you take me. You don't have a choice." The skinwalker dropped to all fours and its body restructured with sounds like wet branches breaking. "I've been hunting your kind for 300 years. The Navajo drove me north, but that just gave me new hunting grounds. New skins. I'm wearing 5 people right now, Oliver. Can you feel them? Can you sense them screaming inside me? He could. God help him, he could. The sensitivity opened up like a wound, and he felt the presence of Charlotte Morrison and 4 others, their consciousness trapped inside the skinwalker like flies in amber, aware but unable to act, forced to witness every horror the creature committed while wearing their stolen identities. The skinwalker lunged. Oliver threw the salt in a wide arc, decades of ranger training guiding his arm to maximize dispersal. Silver metals followed, spinning through rain-slicked air. The tobacco scattered last, sacred herb meeting sacred prohibition, and the skinwalker shrieked, a sound that was every animal it had ever worn, every human it had consumed, all screaming in unison as the protections bit into whatever passed for its flesh. It recoiled, form destabilizing, shifting rapidly through a dozen different shapes as it tried to find one that wasn't vulnerable. Wolf, elk, bear, human, something reptilian, something that might have been a bird but with teeth. Back to Charlotte Morrison. But now her skin was sloughing off, revealing the true horror underneath. Oliver didn't look. Looking would shatter something in his mind that couldn't be repaired. He ran. The trail down was treacherous in darkness, in rain turning to sleet, with his headlamp dying and his lungs burning, and the sound of pursuit behind him. Not footsteps, but the sliding movement of something that didn't need feet, that could flow over rock like liquid, that could be in front of him and behind him simultaneously. His radio crackled to life. "Hayes, respond. We're reading your GPS signal moving at unsafe speeds. What's your status?" He couldn't answer. All his breath was reserved for running, for the desperate animal flight of prey that knows the predator is faster, stronger, more patient. The trail blurred beneath his boots. He fell, skidding on loose scree, tearing his hands open, tasting blood and terror. The sensitivity was overloading completely now, showing him flashes of possible futures. Himself running forever through these mountains, himself worn like a skin, himself becoming the thing he fled from. The skinwalker appeared in his path, still shifting, still wearing fragments of Charlotte Morrison like a partially discarded mask. "You can't outrun me, Oliver. I'm already wearing you. Can't you feel it? The way your fear tastes like coming home?" Oliver's hand found the last silver medal in his pocket, a Saint Christopher, patron saint of travelers, blessed by a priest who'd known what walked in wild places. He drove it forward like a knife, not aiming for the skinwalker's physical form but for the space it occupied, the gap between what it was and what it pretended to be. The metal passed through Charlotte Morrison's face like water, and for one crystalline moment Oliver saw her, the real her, the consciousness trapped inside the monster, still fighting after 3 days of being worn like clothing. She looked at him with eyes that held infinite gratitude and infinite despair. Then the skinwalker exploded outward in a cascade of forms, each one less real than the last, each one fragmenting further until what remained was just wind and rain and the smell of ozone from the storm. Oliver collapsed at Ptarmigan Falls, radio in hand, gasping. "Base. Hayes. Need. Extraction." Patricia's voice. "Copy that. GPS shows you at the falls. Are you injured? Did you find Morrison?" He looked at the metal in his hand, now tarnished black, looked at the forest that had returned to being just forest, empty of impossible things. Looked at his own hands and wondered if he'd be able to tell if something else started looking out through his eyes. "Morrison is gone," he said. "Confirmed deceased. No body recovery possible." What he didn't say, Charlotte Morrison was still out there, still conscious, still trapped inside a thing that wore her skin. That she would be aware as the skinwalker hunted again, used her face to lure other victims, spoke with her voice while digesting their souls. That death would have been mercy, but mercy wasn't what the old things offered. What he couldn't say, that some part of him had stayed in that lake basin, that the skinwalker had tasted his sensitivity and found it delicious, that it would hunt him now across years and distance, patient as stone, waiting for the moment when his belief wavered enough for it to slip inside. 3 weeks later, Oliver Hayes sat in a Denver office across from a department psychiatrist who asked gentle questions about trauma and stress and the importance of maintaining boundaries between empathy and delusion. He answered with the words they needed to hear, took the prescription for antipsychotics he wouldn't fill, accepted the mandatory leave with the understanding that some things couldn't be explained to people who'd never felt the wrongness of the world's hidden corners. Charlotte Morrison's parents held a memorial service in Boston. The official report listed her death as a wilderness accident, probable fall from altitude, body lost to the elements. Oliver didn't attend. He couldn't look at photographs of her smiling face without seeing it twist and shift, couldn't hear recordings of her voice without hearing the harmonics of the thing that had learned to replicate it perfectly. He returned to Glacier only once on a bright October morning when the aspens had reached peak gold and tourists crowded the valley roads. He hiked to Ptarmigan Falls with salt in his pockets and tobacco in his pack, and he built a small cairn where Charlotte's backpack had sat, and he whispered prayers in 3 languages to gods he didn't fully believe in, asking them to grant peace to a soul that had no grave. The forest watched him. He could feel its attention, vast and patient and hungry, could feel the way his sensitivity drew things to him like blood and water, could feel the skinwalker somewhere in the wilderness, wearing new skins, hunting new prey, but always keeping part of its awareness on Oliver Hayes, the one who got away, the one who tasted different, the one worth waiting for. As he descended the trail back toward civilization, Oliver's teeth began to ache, his joints filled with cold. And somewhere behind him, just beyond the edge of hearing, something laughed with Charlotte Morrison's voice. He didn't look back. Some hunts, he'd learned, never truly end. They just pause, stretched across years, patient as the mountains themselves. And every night since Iceberg Lake, when Oliver closed his eyes, he felt the thing waiting. Felt it wearing faces of the people he loved. Felt it getting closer with each moment of doubt, each crack in his certainty that the protections would hold. The sensitive ones, his grandmother had told him once, see the truth of the world. What she hadn't mentioned was the price, that once you'd seen the truth, it could see you back, that it would smile with your face and speak with your voice, and the only question was when, not if, you'd feel your own skin start to loosen, ready to be worn by something that had been practicing for centuries. Oliver Hayes drove away from Glacier National Park, his Garmin GPS showing the route back to Denver, the device's cheerful electronic voice guiding him through turns. But sometimes, in the transitions between towers, in the dead zones where signals failed, the GPS voice would glitch, would sound almost like Charlotte Morrison giving directions, would suggest turns that led back into wilderness, back toward mountains that held things older than humanity's attempt to map them. He never took those turns, but he always heard them calling. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The voicemail arrived at 11:47 p.m. on October 23, 2014. Christopher Dalton had been sitting at his kitchen table in Knoxville, staring at his phone for the past 3 hours, willing it to ring. Ashley's group was supposed to check in by 6. The Great Smoky Mountains had spotty cell coverage, he kept telling himself. They'd probably camped somewhere without signal. 19-year-olds forgot to charge their phones. Reasonable explanations cycled through his mind like a prayer, each repetition growing hollower. Then his phone buzzed. One new voicemail from Ashley's number. His thumb shook as he pressed play. For a moment, only static filled his ear, the crackling hiss of a bad connection fighting through layers of mountain interference. Then Ashley's voice emerged, thin and breathless and wrong. "Dad." A gasp. "Dad, if you get this." The words fractured, buried under a wash of white noise. When her voice returned, it carried a pitch Chris had never heard from his daughter. Not even when she'd broken her arm at 12. Not even during her mother's funeral. Pure animal terror. "Following us. It's been following since the bridge. God, Dad, its legs." A sound erupted in the background. At first, Chris thought it was static, but his engineer's brain recognized the pattern too quickly. Something organic. something vocal. A low, bleating laugh that climbed into a register no human throat should produce. The laugh of something that had learned the shape of laughter but not its purpose. Ashley's voice returned, barely a whisper. "Don't come looking, don't..." A crash, branches snapping. Then her voice, distant now, screaming 3 words that would echo in Chris's skull for every moment that followed. "It smells wrong." The voicemail ended. 43 seconds total. Chris played it again. And again. On the 4th repetition, he started cataloging details with the focused precision that had served him through 23 years as a civil engineer and 4 years as a single father. Ashley mentioned a bridge. The Hazel Creek Trail had an old footbridge near mile marker 6. Following since the bridge suggested they'd made it at least that far before whatever happened. The timestamp on the call, 4:17 p.m., roughly when they should have been setting up camp. He was in his truck by midnight, Ashley's camping permit printout on the passenger seat. Fontana Dam Visitor Center opened at 7 a.m. He'd be there when the doors unlocked. Sleep was impossible, so Chris drove, his high beams cutting through the curves of Highway 129. His phone sat in the cup holder, screen face up, as if Ashley might call back and laugh about the prank, about scaring him like that. The rational part of his mind, the part that dealt in concrete and rebar and load-bearing calculations, tried to construct reasonable explanations. A bear, maybe. Bears could sound almost human sometimes, especially when vocalizing across distances. The fear could have distorted Ashley's perception, but that laugh, that bleating, climbing laugh. At 3 a.m., Chris pulled into a rest stop and played the voicemail again, this time with his earbuds in, volume maxed. He listened for background details. The snapping branches were too rhythmic, too heavy, something large moving with purpose. And beneath Ashley's final scream, almost subliminal, another sound, the distinct, sharp crack of hoofbeats on stone. Chris's hands went numb. He'd grown up in these mountains, had heard every tall tale and local legend whispered around campfires. His own grandfather had sworn he'd seen something in the woods near Cades Cove back in '57. Something that walked on 2 legs but wasn't human, that stank like a livestock pen, that watched him with yellow eyes from between the trees. His grandfather had called it by the name the old-timers used: Goatman, folklore, rural mythology, the kind of stories that kept teenagers from wandering too deep into the forest after dark. Chris didn't believe in folklore. He believed in things he could measure, test, verify. But he also believed the fear in his daughter's voice, and the sounds that accompanied it, and the cold certainty settling in his chest that something had gone very wrong on Hazel Creek Trail. He reached Fontana Dam as dawn broke over the Smokies, painting the ridgelines in shades of amber and rust. The visitor center parking lot was empty except for a single park service truck. Chris sat in his cab, watching the building's dark windows, and forced himself to eat half a protein bar. He'd need his strength. Whatever came next would demand everything he had. At 7:03 a.m., a ranger emerged from the building, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back severely. Her name tag read Mitchell. Chris met her at the door with Ashley's permit and his phone. "My daughter," he said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "She was camping Hazel Creek Trail. She called yesterday afternoon and something's wrong." Ranger Mitchell's expression shifted from bureaucratic politeness to focused attention. "How long has she been out of contact?" "Since 4:17 p.m. yesterday. She left this message." He played the voicemail. The ranger listened once, then asked him to play it again. Her jaw tightened. "Wait here." She disappeared into the back office. Chris heard her voice, clipped and professional, speaking into a radio. "This is Mitchell at Fontana Dam. I need to initiate a search and rescue for Hazel Creek Trail." "Yes, now. Multiple campers. Possible distress situation." 20 minutes later, Chris sat across from Mitchell and another ranger named Torres, a younger man with the kind of lean build that suggested he spent more time on trails than behind desks. A map of Hazel Creek Trail lay spread across the conference table, the 8-mile route marked in green highlighter. "Your daughter's permit indicated 4 campers. Torres said. Ashley Dalton, Madison Pierce, Tyler Jang, and Connor Breck, correct? Chris nodded. They were experienced. Ashley's been camping since she was 10. The trail's rated moderate difficulty, Mitchell said, tracing the route with her finger. But this section, she tapped a spot near mile 6, the old CCC footbridge crosses Hazel Creek here. The bridge is structurally sound, but the ravine below is deep and the currents strong after rain. We had storms 2 days ago. You think they fell? Chris asked. No, you heard the message. Something was following them. Torres and Mitchell exchanged a glance that Chris recognized immediately, the look of professionals deciding how much truth to share with a civilian. Mr. Dalton, Mitchell said carefully, we take all distress calls seriously, but panic can distort perception. Wildlife encounters can seem... Don't. Chris's voice came out harder than intended. I've lived in these mountains my whole life. That sound in the background wasn't any animal I've heard. Another glance between the rangers. Then Torres spoke, his voice lower. How familiar are you with Hazel Creek's history? I know it was logged in the 20s. CCC built trails through there during the Depression. Why? The area has a reputation, Torres said. More disappearances than other trails in the park. Most get written off as hikers going off trail, getting disoriented. But some of the older rangers, the ones who've worked here 30, 40 years, he paused. They don't like patrolling that section, especially past the bridge. Mitchell shot Torres a warning look, but he continued. There have been reports. Hikers claiming they heard things, saw things. Most won't go on record because it sounds crazy, but the descriptions are consistent. Something large, bipedal, smells like rot and ammonia. That's enough, Torres. Mitchell cut in. She turned to Chris. We're assembling a search team. 4 rangers plus a volunteer SAR unit from Maryville. We'll head out within the hour. You can wait here, or we can contact you when... No. Chris stood. I'm going with you. That's against protocol. She's my daughter, which is exactly why you need to stay here. If we're conducting a rescue operation, we can't also be managing a civilian who's emotionally compromised. Chris leaned forward, planting his palms on the table. I'm a licensed civil engineer. I've done structural assessments in the backcountry. I'm certified in wilderness first aid. I've hiked every major trail in this park. All true, though some of those qualifications were stretched thin. And I'm going to find my daughter with or without your help. The question is whether I do it as part of your team or as another person you'll have to rescue. The silence stretched. Finally, Mitchell sighed. You follow orders. You don't wander off. And if I tell you to wait somewhere, you wait. Understood? Understood. Good. We leave in 40 minutes. Torres will get you outfitted. The trail began at the old Hazel Creek access point, a narrow dirt path that wound through second-growth forest. The search team consisted of 7 people, Mitchell and Torres, 2 additional rangers named Hayes and Kowalski, 2 SAR volunteers from Blount County, and Chris. Each carried a standard search pack, first aid, emergency shelter, rope, flares. Mitchell and Hayes had radios, though Mitchell warned that coverage would be intermittent once they descended into the creek valley. The morning was unseasonably warm for late October, the air thick with moisture from the recent storms. Fog clung to the hollows, turning the forest into a series of gray curtains that parted reluctantly as they hiked. For the first hour, the trail was unremarkable. They made good time, covering nearly 3 miles before stopping for a water break. Chris studied the map constantly, calculating distances, estimating where Ashley's group would have camped. The permit listed their intended site as marker 6.2, just past the bridge. At mile 4, Hayes found the first sign. It was subtle. A granola bar wrapper caught in the underbrush, the label sun-faded but readable. Kind bar, dark chocolate cherry, Ashley's favorite. Chris's throat constricted as he watched Hayes bag it as evidence. They came through here, Torres confirmed, examining bent grass along the trail edge. Probably yesterday afternoon based on the vegetation recovery. 4 sets of prints, correct weight distribution for backpackers. They pressed on. The trail descended more steeply now, switchbacking down toward the creek valley. Chris's knees protested the grade, but he kept pace, driven by a gnawing urgency that intensified with each step. At mile 5.3, they found the second sign, and everything changed. One of the Sayar volunteers, a lean woman named Chen, spotted it first, a single boot print in a patch of mud beside the trail, but not a hiking boot. The impression was wrong, the heel too narrow, the toe terminating in a split shape that Chris's brain refused to process correctly. A cloven hoof. Something with a cloven hoof had walked here, its track overlapping the unmistakable tread of a Merrill hiking boot. Bear? Kowalski suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. Hayes crouched beside the print, using a twig to trace its outline. Bears have pads and claws. This is something else. He looked up at Mitchell. You seeing what I'm seeing? Mitchell's face had gone carefully neutral. Let's keep moving. Stay alert. But the atmosphere had shifted. The team moved closer together now, their earlier confidence replaced by a tension that needed no explanation. Chris felt it too. A prickling awareness that they were being observed, evaluated, measured against some unknown criterion. The smell hit them at mile 5.8. It rolled up the trail like a physical presence, the sharp ammonia bite of a livestock pen mixed with something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in summer heat. Chen gagged and pulled her bandana over her nose. Torres swore softly in Spanish. That's not natural decay, Hayes said. That's... Move, Mitchell ordered, suddenly urgent. Everyone, double time to the bridge, now! They jogged, packs bouncing, boots pounding the packed earth. The smell grew stronger, and with it came a sound that Chris felt in his bones before his ears processed it. A low, resonant bleating that rose and fell in a rhythm too deliberate to be random. The same sound from Ashley's voicemail. The Hazel Creek footbridge emerged through the fog, a narrow suspension bridge built by the CCC in the 1930s. Wooden planks stretched across steel cables that spanned a 40-foot ravine. The creek below rushed white and violent, swollen from recent rain. And on the far side of the bridge, scattered across the small clearing like debris from an explosion, was Ashley's camp. Tents torn open, their nylon fabric shredded in long vertical gashes. Backpacks emptied, their contents strewn across the site. Clothes, food, sleeping bags all tangled together in a chaos that spoke of panic and violence. A Coleman stove lay overturned, its fuel canister punctured, white gas staining the ground. But no people, no Ashley, no Madison, Tyler, or Connor. Chris started toward the bridge, but Torres grabbed his arm. Wait, let us clear it first. Mitchell and Hayes crossed first, weapons drawn. Not the usual bear spray and air horns, but actual sidearms that Chris hadn't noticed before. They moved through the campsite methodically, checking behind trees, inside the ruined tents, searching for threats or victims. Clear, Mitchell called back. But you all need to see this. The team crossed the bridge in silence. Chris's legs felt disconnected from his body, moving through dream logic as he approached the destroyed camp. He found Ashley's backpack immediately. The purple North Face she'd gotten for her 18th birthday, now partially eviscerated, its contents scattered. Her journal lay open on the ground, pages fluttering in the light breeze. Chris picked it up with trembling hands. The last entry was dated yesterday, 3:45 p.m. We heard it again. The thing from the bridge. Tyler says it's just a deer or wild boar, but deer don't laugh. It's staying parallel to us, maybe 50 yards out. Keeping pace. Madison wants to pack up and head back, but it'll be dark in 2 hours and we'd have to cross the bridge again. I don't want to cross that bridge with that thing nearby. We're going to secure the camp and wait it out. Probably just curious. That's what I keep telling myself. Just curious. It smells like the goat pen at Anderson Farm. But wronger. Thicker. God, I wish we'd never come here. The entry ended mid-thought, the pen trailing off the page. Chris looked up to find the others gathered around Hayes, who crouched beside something in the dirt. Chris joined them, and his stomach dropped. Tracks. Dozens of them, circling the campsite in a pattern that suggested prolonged observation. But these weren't the tracks of any animal Chris recognized. They were large, nearly the size of a man's footprint, but terminated in split hooves. The gait was wrong too, the stride length suggesting something that moved upright, something tall. Between the hoof prints were other marks, long parallel scratches in the dirt like fingers dragging. Or claws. "This is where they ran," Torres said, pointing to a set of human footprints, running shoes, probably size 8 or 9, that led away from the camp toward the trail's continuation. 4 sets. They headed deeper into the valley. Away from the bridge, Chen noted. Away from the way out. Because something was behind them, Chris said hollowly. Something that pushed them away from escape. Mitchell pulled out her radio. "Base, this is Mitchell. We've located the campsite at marker 6.2. Site shows signs of disturbance and possible wildlife interaction. Campers are not present. We're following their trail deeper into the valley. Be advised." She hesitated, choosing words carefully. "Be advised we may need additional support. We'll update at next checkpoint." The radio crackled back. "Copy that, Mitchell. Air support is on standby if needed. Weather window closes at 1600 hours. Air support. Helicopters." The Park Service was taking this seriously. They formed a new marching order, with Mitchell and Hayes at the front, Chris in the middle with Torres, and Chen and Kowalski bringing up the rear. The trail beyond the camp was less maintained, narrower, the forest pressing close on both sides. The tracks were easy to follow, 4 sets of running feet, pursued by those impossible hoofprints that appeared and disappeared seemingly at random. Sometimes the pursuit tracks were close, within yards. Sometimes they vanished for stretches, only to reappear ahead of the human tracks as if whatever made them could move through the forest faster than physics should allow. At 12:47 p.m., they found Madison Pierce. She was sitting against a maple tree 50 yards off the trail, her back to the trunk, her hiking boots still laced. At first, Chris thought she was resting. Then he saw her eyes, open, staring at nothing, pupils fully dilated. Her face was locked in an expression of absolute terror, mouth open in a silent scream that would never sound. Hayes checked for a pulse, though they all knew what he'd find. She's gone. No visible trauma, no wounds. But she's been dead for hours, probably since last night. "What killed her?" Kowalski asked. "I don't know." Hayes' voice was tight. "It's like she just stopped." Torres examined the ground around Madison's body. "No struggle. She sat down here and died." "Fear," Chris heard himself say. "She died of fear." Everyone looked at him. He continued, his voice coming from somewhere distant. "Fatal arrhythmia brought on by extreme stress. The heart just stops. It's rare, but possible. If she was terrified enough, running hard enough, her heart could have..." He couldn't finish. The image of Ashley suffering the same fate made his lungs seize. Mitchell radioed the location to base, her voice mechanical as she described finding the first victim. The word victim felt wrong. It implied violence, an attacker. But Madison bore no marks, no signs of struggle. She'd simply fled until her heart gave out. They covered her body with an emergency blanket and marked the location with a GPS waypoint. Then they continued, because 3 others were still missing, and darkness was only hours away. The trail deteriorated into little more than a game path, winding through increasingly dense forest. The fog had thickened, reducing visibility to 30 feet. Sounds became distorted. Chris couldn't tell if the snapping branches he heard came from ahead or behind, from his own team, or something else. At 2:15 p.m., they found Tyler Jong's body. He'd made it another mile past Madison, but his end was the same. No trauma, no wounds, just that expression of terminal horror frozen on his face. He'd died running, his body sprawled forward as if he'd collapsed mid-stride. 2 down, Chen whispered. "Where are the others?" Chris pulled out his phone, checked the voicemail timestamp again. 4:17 p.m. yesterday. It had been nearly 24 hours. Ashley and Connor were still out here somewhere, alive or dead. And Chris was no closer to finding them. The bleeding sound returned, echoing through the fog. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off trees and rocks until direction became meaningless. The sound was closer now, no longer distant observation but active presence. Hayes drew his sidearm. "We need to move. Now." They ran, abandoning the careful tracking work, simply following the general direction of the human footprints. The trail ended abruptly at a rocky outcropping, and beyond it, the forest opened into a small clearing dominated by an ancient oak tree, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter, its branches spreading like skeletal fingers. Connor Breck hung from one of those branches, not by a rope. The branch had somehow grown through his torso, emerging from his back and wrapping around his chest, suspending him 10 feet off the ground. His mouth hung open in a scream that had died hours ago. His eyes were missing, the sockets empty and black. "Jesus Christ," Kowalski breathed. But it was Torres who voiced what they were all thinking. "That's not possible. Trees don't grow through people. Not that fast. Not like that." Yet there Connor hung, his body integrated with the oak in a way that defied every law of biology Chris understood. The bark had begun growing around the entry wound, as if the tree had been absorbing him slowly, claiming him for the forest. And beneath the hanging body, scratched into the dirt in letters 3 feet high, was a message: "Turn back." The letters were formed from gouges in the earth, deep furrows that could only have been made by something with immense strength dragging claws or hooves through packed soil. "That's for us," Hayes said quietly. "Whatever did this is warning us." "Where's Ashley?" Chris demanded, his voice cracking. "Where's my daughter?" Mitchell grabbed his shoulder. "Chris, we need to call this in. We need..." The smell hit them again, but stronger now, so powerful that Chen doubled over and vomited. The ammonia burn made Chris's eyes water, but beneath it was that other smell. Organic rot, livestock pen, and something spicy sweet that he couldn't place. Then he heard it. The sound of something large moving through the underbrush circling the clearing. Not trying to be quiet, wanting them to hear. And with it came breathing, deep resonant exhalations that sounded almost human but held an undertone of animal snort. The breathing of something with a chest cavity too large, lungs too powerful. "Everyone back to back," Mitchell ordered. "Weapons out." They formed a tight circle in the center of the clearing beneath Connor's suspended corpse. Chris had no weapon except a 4-inch folding knife, but he pulled it out anyway, the blade laughably small in his shaking hand. The breathing continued, circling. Through the fog, Chris caught glimpses of movement, something tall, something dark, something that walked on 2 legs but bent wrong at the joints. Then it stepped into view. Chris's mind rejected what his eyes reported. The thing stood at least 7 feet tall, its body covered in coarse hair the color of old blood. Its legs were digitigrade, bending backward like a goat's, ending in massive cloven hooves that sank into the earth with each step. But its torso was almost human, too broad, too muscular, but recognizably bipedal. Arms hung to its knees, ending in hands that were simultaneously fingers and hooves, as if the anatomy couldn't decide what it wanted to be. But it was the head that shattered Chris's sanity. A goat skull, elongated and wrong, with horns that spiraled back and out, each twist decorated with hanging objects. Small bones, strips of fabric, something that might have been hair. The eye sockets held yellow eyes with horizontal pupils that didn't blink, that tracked each member of the team with predatory intelligence. And the mouth, God, the mouth, opened too wide, revealing too many teeth, each one sharp and yellowed like aged ivory. When it exhaled, the smell rolled over them like a wave, and Chris understood what Ashley had meant. It didn't smell like a goat. It smelled wrong. It smelled like something that had studied goats and decided to wear their scent as a costume, but couldn't quite get the details right. The goatman tilted its head, studying them. Then it opened its mouth and laughed. That bleeding, climbing laugh from the voicemail, but louder now, modulated with horrifying intentionality. The laugh of something that understood humor's shape, but not its purpose, that mimicked joy without feeling it. When it spoke, Chris's bladder nearly gave out. "Turn back." The voice was Ashley's, a perfect imitation of his daughter's tone, her inflection, her accent, but stretched, distorted, played back through vocal cords that had never been human. "Dad, turn back." Hayes fired. 3 shots, center mass, the reports deafening in the enclosed clearing. The bullets struck. Chris saw the impact, saw dark fluid spray, but the goatman didn't flinch. It looked down at the wounds, then back up at Hayes, and its mouth stretched wider. "Hurt," it said in Ashley's voice. "You hurt me, Dad." Then it charged. The next 30 seconds dissolved into chaos. The team scattered as the goatman bounded forward with impossible speed, its hooves striking the ground with the force of sledgehammers. Kowalski went down first, the creature's hand hooves catching him across the chest and launching him into a tree with a crack that was definitely ribs breaking. Chen and Torres ran for the tree line. Mitchell tried to reload. Hayes fired again and again, each shot finding its mark and doing nothing. Chris didn't run. He couldn't. Because behind the goatman, partially hidden in the fog, he saw another figure. Human-sized. Purple North Face jacket. "Ashley!" he screamed. The figure moved, stumbling, and Chris saw his daughter's face. Dirty, scratched, but alive. Her eyes met his across the clearing, and her mouth formed words. "Run. Dad, run." But Chris didn't run. He charged toward her, around the goatman's flank, driven by the single thought that had kept him going for 24 hours. Save Ashley. Whatever it takes, save Ashley. He almost made it. His hand actually touched hers, fingers interlocking, her skin cold but real. For one perfect moment, Chris believed they might escape. Then the goatman's arm wrapped around his chest from behind, lifting him off the ground as easily as Chris might lift a child. The pressure was immense, crushing, driving the air from his lungs. He heard ribs crack, his own this time, and distantly heard Ashley screaming his name. The goatman brought Chris close to its face. The yellow eyes studied him with an intelligence that was worse than animal rage because it suggested understanding, choice, intention. The creature opened its mouth, revealing that impossible array of teeth, and when it spoke again, it used Chris's own voice, his own words from 1,000 bedtime stories. Once upon a time, there was a father who didn't listen, who didn't turn back when warned, who thought his love could defeat the forest. It dropped Chris. He hit the ground hard, his broken ribs screaming, and watched through dimming vision as the goatman turned toward Ashley. "No," Chris gasped. "Please, take me. Leave her, please." The goatman looked back at him, and for the first time, Chris saw something in those yellow eyes that might have been amusement. Or pity. It was impossible to tell. "Your daughter," it said in Ashley's voice, "knows the rules. She cruised. She saw. She knows." Ashley was backing away now, her face a mask of terror, and Chris understood with horrifying certainty that she'd seen this thing before, had encountered it during their flight through the forest, had learned something that he didn't yet know. The goatman reached out with one hand hoof and touched Ashley's forehead with impossible gentleness. She went rigid, her eyes rolling back, her mouth opening in a silent scream. When the goatman removed its hand, Ashley collapsed, but she was breathing. Chris could see her chest rising and falling in the measured rhythm of deep sleep. The creature turned back to Chris. "The bridge," it said in its own voice now, a voice like stones grinding together, like wind through a deadfall, like nothing that should speak. "The bridge is the boundary. She crossed. She saw. She stays." "What are you?" Chris managed to ask through the pain. "Guardian, punishment, payment." The goatman tilted its head. "The forest has rules. Your kind forgets." I remind. It leaned closer, and Chris smelled that wrongness again, that scent of livestock pen and rot and something spicy that he suddenly recognized. Wild rosemary, crushed underfoot. The smell of the old CCC camps, the scent of the Depression-era workers who'd built these trails and bridges and who'd sometimes disappeared into the mountains, never to return. How many bridges had they built? How many boundaries had they marked? And what had they paid for the privilege? "Take me," Chris whispered. "Let her go. Take me instead." The Goatman studied him with those horizontal pupilled eyes. Then it laughed again. Not Ashley's voice this time, but that bleating, climbing sound that echoed off the trees and seemed to reshape the fog. "Already have you," it said. "Already have her. Bridge is crossed. Boundary is broken. Both stay." It straightened, rising to its full height, towering over Chris's broken form. "Your pack," it said, gesturing toward the other rangers, who Chris could now see scattered at the clearing's edge, weapons drawn but too terrified to approach. They turn back. They tell others. "Bridge is closed. This valley is closed. 50 years closed." Mitchell's voice shaking but steady. "We can't leave them. We can't leave." The word came out as a roar, no longer speech but pure sound, the voice of avalanche and hurricane and the cracking of ice in spring. "Leave or join." The team left. Chris heard their footsteps, their retreat, their radio calls back to base reporting officer down, civilian casualties, recommend immediate evacuation. He heard Mitchell arguing, pleading, demanding backup. He heard all of it fade as they withdrew across the boundary, back over the bridge, back to the world of regulations and radios and things that made sense. And Chris lay on the forest floor, broken ribs grinding with each breath, and watched as the Goatman gathered Ashley's unconscious form and carried her deeper into the fog, toward the ancient oak where Connor's body still hung. "Wait," Chris called weakly. "Where are you taking her?" The Goatman paused, looking back over its shoulder. When it spoke again, it used Chris's own voice from Ashley's childhood, from the camping trips they'd taken together before her mother died. "The forest takes care of its own. She'll be happier here. No more school, no more deadlines, no more grief. Just the green and the growing and the forgetting." "That's not life," Chris said. "That's not..." "No," the Goatman agreed. "It's not. But it's not death either. It's the space between, where I live, where she'll live, where you'll live, until the forest has taken enough from your bones to let you sleep." It disappeared into the fog, carrying Ashley, leaving Chris alone in the clearing with Connor's hanging corpse and the growing darkness. Chris tried to move. His legs wouldn't respond. The ribs were bad, probably punctured something internal. He tasted copper at the back of his throat, blood filling his lungs, drowning from the inside. He'd failed, come all this way, faced the impossible, and failed anyway. As consciousness faded, Chris became aware of other sounds in the clearing. Whispers, footsteps, the soft bleating of something approaching from multiple directions. When he forced his eyes open, he saw them. Smaller versions of the Goatman, child-sized, with the same wrongness in their proportions, the same intelligence in their yellow eyes. They surrounded him, these children of the boundary, and Chris realized with a horror deeper than anything he'd felt before, that he recognized some of them. The missing hikers Torres had mentioned, the disappearances that stretched back decades. All here, all changed, all serving the forest's guardian. One of them knelt beside him, a boy, maybe 12 in human years, with curling horns and a smile that was almost kind. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through leaves. "It doesn't hurt for long. The changing, you fight it, it hurts. You accept it, it's almost peaceful. Most accept." "Ashley," Chris managed to say. "Sister," the boy thing corrected. "She'll be sister soon. You'll be brother. We're all siblings here. All family. The forest provides." Chris wanted to fight, to rage, to tear the world apart with his bare hands, but his body was failing, his vision narrowing to a tunnel, his heartbeat slowing to a countdown. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Ashley, emerging from the fog, walking under her own power now but changed. Her eyes had shifted, the pupils beginning to elongate. Small nubs emerged from her forehead, the beginning of horns. And when she knelt beside him, placing her hand on his chest, he felt the warmth of the forest flowing into him, rewriting him, claiming him. "It's okay, Dad," she said, her voice already taking on that resonant quality, that wrongness. "We'll be together, just like you wanted, forever and ever, together in the green." Then the forest took him, and Christopher Dalton, civil engineer and single father, ceased to exist in any meaningful way. 3 days later, a full SAR team returned to Hazel Creek Trail with the Smokies' chief ranger, a FBI agent specializing in missing persons, and enough firepower to handle a small war. They found the bridge intact, the trail unmarked, the campsite at marker 6.2 empty of everything except disturbed earth, and a single purple North Face backpack. They found no bodies, no signs of struggle, no evidence that anyone had camped there at all, except for that backpack and a journal with one final entry that hadn't been there before. The bridge is the boundary. Some boundaries should not be crossed. This trail is closed by order of the National Park Service, effective immediately and for a period of not less than 50 years. This closure is non-negotiable. This closure will be enforced. Tell others. The forest keeps what crosses its borders. It kept us. It's kinder than you'd think. We don't hurt anymore. We don't grieve. We just serve, and watch, and wait. Dad wanted to save me. He did, in a way. We're together now. Both of us free from the world's weight. Both of us changed into something that doesn't need saving. Don't look for us, don't cross the bridge, let the forest keep its secrets. A. Dalton. The trail was closed that afternoon. Barricades went up at the Fontana Dam access point with signs reading, "Trail closed, hazardous conditions." The official Park Service report cited structural instability in the CCC-era bridge and dangerous wildlife activity. Ranger Mitchell resigned 2 weeks later. In her exit interview, she said only that some places in the Smokies were older than the park, older than the nation, older than any name humans had given them. Those places had rules, and the price for breaking those rules was higher than any rescue operation could pay. The FBI agent closed the case as missing, presumed dead in wilderness accident. 4 college students who'd made a tragic miscalculation, gotten lost, succumbed to the elements. It happened every year, would happen again. But the rangers who worked the Smokies, the old ones especially, knew better. They knew about Hazel Creek. They knew about the bridge. They knew about the things that walked the boundary between the forest and the world, the guardians that demanded payment for trespass. And on foggy nights in late October, when the wind came up from the creek valleys and carried strange sounds through the trees, those same rangers would stand at their stations and listen to the bleating laughter echoing from closed trails. They would remember Mitchell's words whispered before she left. "I saw it. Just once, at the clearing edge before we retreated. The Goatman standing at the boundary, with 2 figures beside it. One tall, one shorter, both growing horns, both with yellow eyes, both watching us go." "Were they," the interviewer had asked, "were they asking for help?" Mitchell had shaken her head. "No. They were warning us, telling us to stay away, to let the forest keep them." She'd paused, then added one final detail that never made it into any official report. The tall one waved, the exact same wave Chris Dalton used when he dropped Ashley off at school. Same gesture, same timing, like he was saying goodbye to his daughter, except his daughter was standing right beside him waving too, and they were smiling. The Hazel Creek Trail remains closed. It will remain closed for another 46 years, until 2064, when the current order expires. Whether it reopens then depends on the rangers of that future era, on whether they're brave enough or foolish enough to test the boundary again. The forest keeps its secrets. The forest keeps its own, and somewhere in the green depths beyond the bridge, a family that was once human tends to the ancient oak, watches over the boundary, and waits for the next crossing. The forest is patient. The forest is hungry. The forest always wins. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Chris and Ashley. The Cho River pattern. The spreadsheet refused to make sense. Christopher Reeves had built his career on patterns, 15 years with the National Park Service analyzing search and rescue data, identifying trends invisible to field rangers operating on instinct and adrenaline. Numbers told stories that eyewitnesses couldn't. Statistics revealed truths that panic obscured. He'd optimized response times across 3 districts, reduced preventable deaths by 18%, earned commendations from regional directors who barely understood his methodology. But this dataset felt wrong in ways his training couldn't categorize. He adjusted his reading glasses and leaned closer to the dual monitors in his cramped office at Olympic National Park headquarters. Outside, November rain hammered Port Angeles with the relentless monotony that defined Washington's coastal autumn. 283 days of precipitation annually. He'd memorized that statistic his first week transferring here from Yellowstone in 2006. The Olympic Peninsula's temperate rainforest created unique search complications. Visibility reduced to 15 feet in mature growth, saturation compromising scent trails for K9 units, moss obscuring footprints within hours, standard complications, quantifiable variables. This was something else. 5 disappearances along a 13-mile stretch of the Ho River Trail in 18 months. Not unusual by itself, Olympic averaged 47 missing persons annually across its 922,000 acres. Hikers underestimated terrain difficulty, solo backpackers suffered medical emergencies, tourists wandered off marked paths chasing elk. Christopher had processed hundreds of such incidents, watched the statistical curves of recovery times and survival rates, noted how quickly wilderness consumed the unprepared. But 5 disappearances on the same trail, all young women, all solo hikers, all vanishing between mile marker 7 and 9, all during new moon phases. That scraped against probability until it drew blood. Christopher opened his field notebook, the leather-bound journal that had accompanied him through a decade of backcountry analysis. He'd documented the pattern 3 weeks ago, when a University of Washington student named Megan Hartley failed to return from a day hike. 23 years old, anthropology major, experienced backpacker. Her vehicle remained in the trailhead parking lot, a green Subaru Outback with decals from a dozen national parks. Her permits indicated she'd planned a simple out and back to the Ho River campground, 6 hours maximum, well within her capabilities. She'd been missing 72 hours when Christopher first noticed the pattern. He pulled her file now, comparing it against the others. February 2007, Jennifer Costa, 26, marine biology PhD candidate. April 2007, Allison Kim, 22, art student. September 2007, Rebecca Osworth, 25, freelance photographer. January 2008, Sophia Delgado, 24, medical resident on vacation. And now Megan Hartley, October 2008, all fit, athletic women, all with substantial hiking experience, all carrying appropriate gear. Rangers had inventoried their vehicles, found nothing suggesting negligence or poor preparation. 3 had filed detailed itineraries. 2 had checked in with the ranger station before departing, discussed trail conditions, demonstrated familiarity with wilderness safety protocols. None had been found. Standard search procedures had yielded nothing. K9 units lost scent at mile marker 8 with disturbing consistency. Ground teams found no physical evidence, no torn clothing, no scattered gear, no signs of animal predation or struggle. Helicopter thermal imaging detected nothing. The women had simply stepped into that specific mile of trail and ceased to exist in any documentable way. Christopher cross-referenced weather data. All 5 disappearances occurred during overcast conditions with precipitation. Not unusual for Olympic, the Ho rainforest received 140 inches of rain annually. But combined with the new moon phases, it created near absolute darkness. Visibility would have been minimal, perhaps 5 feet even with flashlights. He opened another file, one he'd requisitioned from the park's historical archives. The request had raised eyebrows. Why would a data analyst need century-old incident reports? But his reputation granted latitude. The brittle documents told a story he wished he hadn't uncovered. 1910. 4 women vanished from the same trail segment over a 9-month period. Japanese immigrants, ages 19 to 27, all from a small community that had established itself near the Ho River mouth. The incident stopped abruptly in December 1910, coinciding with the community's mysterious abandonment. Christopher had found additional records indicating the settlement's male population had departed within days of the 4th disappearance, leaving behind structures, tools, personal belongings, as if they'd fled something that made material possessions irrelevant. The historical reports contained details that made Christopher's methodical mind recoil from implications his training said couldn't exist. Multiple witnesses, white settlers and indigenous Quileute tribe members both, reported seeing a woman in traditional Japanese clothing near the trail, always at dusk, always near running water. Descriptions were consistent across unrelated accounts: white garment, black hair obscuring her face, an unnatural stillness even as she appeared to move through the forest. The reports used words Christopher's empirical framework struggled to process: Yurei, Onryo, Kaiden, Japanese terms the translators hadn't bothered explaining, as if the foreign words themselves carried contamination. One Quileute elder, interviewed by a territorial administrator in 1911, had been more direct. "The angry dead don't rest in wet ground. That woman drowned with hate in her heart, and hate doesn't dissolve in river water. You people brought something here that doesn't follow your rules." Christopher closed the historical file. He'd spent 3 weeks trying to find rational explanations. Coincidence, statistical anomaly, incomplete data. His background in applied mathematics screamed that correlation didn't equal causation, that human pattern recognition evolved to detect threats even when none existed, that his job was analyzing what could be measured and quantified. But he'd also spent 3 weeks lying awake at 3 a.m., listening to rain assault his apartment windows, thinking about 5 women who'd walked into darkness and never emerged. His desk phone rang, the clunky landline that was more reliable than cell coverage in Port Angeles. He recognized the extension. Marcus Chen, Field Operations Supervisor. "Chris, we've got something." Marcus's voice carried the tight control of someone managing panic. "Hiker called in from the Ho Ranger Station. Found personal effects at mile marker 8. Backpack, jacket, water bottles. ID says they belong to Megan Hartley." Christopher's throat constricted. "Condition?" "Arranged. That's the word the ranger used. Not scattered, not torn. Arranged in a clearing just off the trail, like someone set them down carefully." A pause. "There's something else." The hiker said the gear was placed around. Chris, he said it looked like a shrine. Stones stacked in specific patterns. Plants that don't grow in that area. He thinks maybe cherry blossoms, but that doesn't make sense. Wrong season, wrong climate. "I'm coming out." Christopher was already pulling his field jacket from the coat rack, checking his pack. Garmin E-Trex GPS unit, fully charged. Motorola two-way radio. First aid kit. USGS topographical maps of the Ho corridor in waterproof sleeve. LED flashlight with spare batteries. Everything measured, accounted for, rational. "It's already past noon," Marcus said. "You won't make it in and out before dark. Trail conditions are deteriorating. We've got a front moving in, temperature dropping. I can't authorize solo entry, not with the weather." "Then come with me." Silence. Then, "Chris, I've got 2 teams still processing the coastal section, and we just got word of a possible hypothermia case near Deer Lake. I don't have personnel for what might be. What's probably just a disturbed hiker playing games." 5 women, Marcus. Same trail, same moon phase, same conditions. Christopher heard the edge in his own voice, the careful control slipping. "And now we have physical evidence placed deliberately. This isn't random." "I know." Marcus sighed, and Christopher heard decades of wilderness experience wrestling with bureaucratic limitations. "Look, I can clear you for entry if you go in pairs minimum. And I want hourly radio checks. First missed check, I'm sending a full extraction team regardless of weather." "Who's available?" "Jenny Kawasaki just finished a patrol in the Quino section. She's back at headquarters, could meet you at the Ho trailhead in 90 minutes. Marcus's voice softened slightly. "Chris, I know you don't do field work anymore. Desk job, remember? You sure about this?" Christopher looked at his monitors. the spreadsheets that had transformed from data into something that felt like accusation. 5 names. 5 women who'd trusted the patterns, marked trails, established protocols, the bureaucratic machinery of safety that Christopher helped maintain. And that machinery had failed them in ways the incident reports couldn't capture. "I'm sure," he said. The drive from Port Angeles to the Hoh Rainforest Visitor Center took 97 minutes in optimal conditions. Christopher made it in 83, his aging Honda CR-V handling the winding roads with utilitarian efficiency. Rain intensified as he pushed deeper into the peninsula's interior, trading coastal sprawl for the oppressive density of old-growth forest. Douglas fir and Sitka spruce rose like organic architecture, their canopies creating secondary darkness even at 1 p.m. Roosevelt elk watched from roadside with the patient stillness of creatures who understood they were more native than any vehicle passing through their domain. He'd spent 2 years behind a desk, removed from field operations after a situation in Yellowstone that his personnel file described as a stress-induced evaluation discrepancy. The clinical language obscured reality. He'd suffered a breakdown during a winter search operation, convinced he'd calculated survivor probability incorrectly, spent 36 hours hiking in circles while his team searched for him instead of the missing family he'd been trying to save. They'd found him hypothermic and incoherent, muttering equations that no longer added up. 3 weeks of psychiatric evaluation, diagnosis of acute adjustment disorder with anxiety features, recommendation for desk assignment. Christopher had accepted it willingly. Numbers were safer than forests. Patterns were cleaner than human variables. But patterns had led him back to the field. Jenny Kawasaki was waiting at the Hoh River trailhead when Christopher arrived, her NPS patrol truck parked beside the weathered visitor information kiosk. She was 10 years younger than Christopher, Japanese-American, 3rd-generation Pacific Northwest, built like someone who'd spent her entire adult life carrying 60-pound packs through difficult terrain. Her family had history in the area. She'd mentioned once that her great-grandparents had emigrated from Hokkaido in 1908, settled briefly near the Hoh River before relocating to Seattle. Christopher hadn't pressed for details then, but now that historical connection felt significant in ways he couldn't articulate. "Heard you finally got tired of spreadsheets," she said, adjusting her pack straps. Marcus gave me the brief. Arranged belongings, possible ritual elements, all kinds of weird shit we're probably not supposed to officially acknowledge. "You don't have to come." Christopher checked his GPS coordinates against the USGS map, marking their entry point. "I know this looks like you've found something that makes the hair on your neck stand up?" Jenny's expression was unreadable. "Yeah. I've worked this area for 6 years, Chris. I know which trails feel wrong. The Hoh River Trail past Mile 7? That's been wrong since I started here." She paused, weighing something. "My grandmother told me stories about this place. Old stories, from before the family moved to Seattle. She said her mother's cousin disappeared on this trail in 1910, just walked into the forest and never came back. 4 other women vanished that year. My great-grandmother said they'd angered something, broken a rule they didn't know existed." Christopher felt his analytical mind struggling against information that belonged in folklore, not incident reports. "What kind of rule?" "The kind that doesn't translate well." Jenny started toward the trailhead, and Christopher fell into step beside her. "There's a Japanese concept called onnin, lingering resentment that survives death. When someone dies with intense hatred or injustice, that emotion doesn't dissipate. It calcifies, becomes something that exists independent of the person who felt it." She glanced at him. "Your reports mentioned the historical settlement. Did you find any records about how those women died?" "No official cause of death." Christopher navigated around a massive root system, the trail already slick with moss and decomposition. The territorial administrator's report just listed them as missing, presumed dead. But there were informal accounts. One local doctor's journal mentioned examining a body pulled from the Hoh River in November 1910. Female, Japanese cause of death, consistent with drowning. But the doctor noted something unusual. The body showed no signs of struggle, no water in the lungs, like she'd been dead before entering the river. Or drowned by something that didn't need to hold her head underwater, Jenny said quietly. They hiked in silence after that, following the well-maintained trail as it wound through cathedral groves of Sitka spruce. The Hoh rainforest was considered one of the most pristine, temperate rainforests in North America. 300 feet of canopy reducing ground-level light to perpetual twilight. Epiphytes and mosses coating every surface in layers of green so dense it felt like walking through chlorophyll. Christopher had studied the ecosystem statistics, biomass per acre exceeding 500 tons, some trees over 500 years old, mycorrhizal networks connecting root systems in collaborative webs that scientists barely understood. Beautiful, statistically remarkable, and increasingly suffocating. They reached mile marker 7 at 2:47 p.m. Christopher noted the time in his field journal, maintaining the documentation habits that gave him structure. Temperature had dropped to 43 degrees Fahrenheit, precipitation steady at 0.2 inches per hour. Visibility reduced to approximately 20 feet. His GPS showed they were exactly 47.8601 degree, 123.8959 degree W, coordinates he'd memorized from incident reports. Radio check, Jenny said, keying her Motorola. Base, this is Ranger Kawasaki with Christopher Reeves. We're at mile 7, proceeding to reported location. Conditions deteriorating but manageable. Marcus's response crackled with static. Copy that. Hourly checks mandatory. Weather service shows storm intensifying. You've got maybe 3 hours of viable conditions. Find what you need and extract. The trail narrowed as they pushed deeper, old growth pressing closer, the river's voice growing louder through the trees. Christopher's analytical mind cataloged details obsessively. Specific moss species, elk scat age, trail erosion patterns, anything to avoid thinking about the weight building in his chest, the sense of expectation that had nothing to do with meteorological data. Mile marker 8 appeared through the mist, like an accusation. There. Jenny pointed to a faint path diverging from the main trail, barely visible through sword ferns and salal. That's new, or old that's been recently reopened. Christopher consulted his topographical map. This isn't marked. There's no established spur trail in this section. No. Jenny unslung her pack, pulled out her own GPS unit for backup tracking. But there's a clearing about 50 yards in, near an old creek bed. If someone wanted to arrange something privately, that's where they'd do it. They left the marked trail, immediately entering terrain that felt fundamentally different. The forest here was older somehow. Christopher knew that was impossible. The trees were the same age as those 20 yards back, but his perception insisted otherwise. Lichen patterns looked more complex. Root systems seemed to move with deliberate architecture rather than organic randomness. And the silence was wrong. An absence of bird calls and insect hum that statistics said shouldn't exist in a functioning ecosystem. The clearing opened before them like a wound. Megan Hartley's belongings were arranged in a precise circle approximately 15 feet in diameter. Her North Face backpack sat at the northern point unzipped, contents displayed methodically. Water filtration system, emergency bivvy, first aid supplies, food rations, climbing rope. Her Gore-Tex jacket was spread carefully to the east, arms extended as if crucified. Water bottles marked south and west. In the center of the circle, her hiking boots were placed toe-to-toe, laces removed and arranged in a spiral pattern that made Christopher's vision swim when he looked directly at it. But it was the stones that transformed arrangement into ritual. Hundreds of river rocks, each no larger than a fist, were stacked in 13 cairns around the circle's perimeter. Not random stacking, each cairn was precisely 7 stones high, placed at mathematically exact intervals. Between the cairns, someone had woven branches into patterns that resembled Japanese characters. Christopher didn't read Japanese, but something about the shapes felt like language, like meaning compressed into symbols his conscious mind couldn't process, but his hindbrain recognized as communication. Shimenawa, Jenny whispered. Shinto sacred rope, used to mark boundaries between the sacred and profane, or to bind something. She approached one of the branch patterns carefully, not These aren't exact, wrong materials, wrong construction, but they're imitating the concept. Someone marked this as sacred space, or as a prison. Christopher's hands shook as he documented the scene with his digital camera, a Sony CyberShot DSC-H2, 6 megapixels, state-of-the-art for 2008. His analytical training demanded systematic photography. Wide shots, detail shots, measurements. But his attention kept fracturing, drawn to elements his database of patterns couldn't categorize. The cherry blossoms, fresh sakura petals scattered across Megan's jacket, dozens of delicate pink flowers that couldn't exist here. Cherry trees didn't grow in Olympic rainforest. The climate was wrong, the soil composition incorrect, and it was November, months past blooming season even if they had been transplanted. Christopher picked up a single petal, felt it dissolve between his fingers like snow. Jenny. His voice sounded distant, filtered through layers of impossibility. This doesn't make sense. No, she agreed. It doesn't. But it's consistent. Consistent with what? With kaiden, Japanese ghost stories that follow specific rules, the wronged woman who returns, the boundary between worlds becoming permeable, offerings and rituals to appease or contain. Jenny was cataloging the scene with her own camera, her movements professional despite the tremor in her hands. My grandmother told me about Oiwa, Okiku, Otsuyu, classical stories where women died violently, returned as yurei seeking vengeance or resolution. They're not just folklore, Chris. They're templates, warnings about what happens when certain kinds of injustice create permanent wounds in... She stopped, searching for words. In the fabric of things. Christopher forced himself back into data analysis. Megan was researching anthropology, Japanese immigrant history. What if she discovered something? Found records of what happened in 1910, came here trying to document it, and became part of the pattern instead. Jenny knelt beside the spiral of laces, careful not to disturb them. These aren't random. This is a deliberate recreation of something, a remembrance or a summons or... She froze. Chris, look at the ground inside the circle. He moved closer, directing his flashlight downward. Footprints, bare feet in mud, small and feminine, arranged in a walking pattern that circled the perimeter once, twice, 3 times, before leading away from the clearing deeper into the forest. But the prints were wrong. Too shallow, lacking the depth that weight and motion should create, as if something with human shape but negligible mass had moved here. And they were wet. Fresh. Despite 3 days of Megan's absence, despite rain that should have washed away any tracks, these prints gleamed with moisture that looked thicker than water. Christopher felt his careful rationality cracking like ice under pressure. We need to call this in, get forensics, get what? Jenny's laugh had edges that could draw blood. Marcus will send a team that'll document everything, photograph everything, file reports that go nowhere because there's no framework for this. 5 women vanished from this trail, Chris. Now we've found evidence that something deliberate is happening. Evidence that points to... She gestured helplessly at the clearing. To what? A serial killer with an obsession with Japanese ghost stories? Someone powerful enough to access cherry blossoms in November to move through this forest without leaving normal tracks? There has to be a rational explanation. Why? Jenny met his eyes. Because your degree says so? Because statistical analysis doesn't include variables for the supernatural? I've worked wilderness for 6 years, and I've seen things that don't belong in incident reports. Elk moving in patterns that spell words if you map their tracks. Trees growing overnight where nothing grew before. Sounds that come from directions that don't exist. Her voice dropped. This forest is old, Chris. Older than European settlement. Older than the tribes who lived here before them. And old places remember things. They remember injustices. Christopher's radio crackled. Reeves, Kawasaki, hourly check. He keyed the transmit button with fingers that felt distant from his own body. We're at the location, found the belongings. Scene is complex. We're documenting now. Copy. Weather's accelerating. You've got maybe 90 minutes before conditions become hazardous. Complete your documentation and extract. Understood. Christopher released the button, looked at Jenny. "We follow the footprints." "That's insane." "I know." He pulled out his GPS, marked their current location, then started toward where the prints led into the undergrowth. "But we have 90 minutes before we have to leave. And those tracks might lead to Megan, or to whoever arranged this scene, or to..." He stopped, unable to voice the third option his mind kept circling back to. Jenny checked her equipment, adjusted her pack, chambered a round in the Glock 23 holstered at her hip, standard NPS Ranger sidearm, 40 caliber, 15 round capacity. Christopher had one too, though he'd never fired it outside qualifying ranges. The weight felt wrong against his side now, simultaneously insufficient and obscenely aggressive. What did bullets matter against footprints that shouldn't exist? They left the marked clearing, following tracks that led deeper into rainforest terrain increasingly divorced from mapped topology. The undergrowth thickened impossibly. Christopher's topographical map showed this area as standard mixed forest with moderate ground cover. But reality presented something different. Ferns tall enough to block vision. Fallen logs covered in moss, so thick they'd become geological features rather than decomposition. The river's voice changed pitch. No longer the natural rush of water over stone, but something more deliberate, almost rhythmic. Like breathing, the footprints continued ahead, always just visible, leading them in directions that Christopher's GPS insisted couldn't exist. His unit showed them moving northwest, but the sun's fading position through the canopy indicated southwest. When he checked his compass, the needle spun lazily, refusing to settle on magnetic north. "We're losing instrumentation," he said, fighting the panic rising in his throat. "GPS coordinates aren't matching visual landmarks. Radio..." He keyed his Motorola. Nothing but static. "We're out of range. That shouldn't be possible. We're only half a mile from the trail." "We're not half a mile from anything." Jenny's voice was tight. "Look behind us." Christopher turned. The path they'd followed was gone, not obscured by vegetation or hidden by terrain, simply absent. The forest had closed behind them like water filling a wake, presenting unbroken wall of ferns and moss and trees that his memory insisted they'd walked past seconds ago. "We need to go back." He heard the edge of hysteria in his voice, tried to control it through breathing exercises they'd taught him during psychiatric evaluation. 4 counts in, hold 4, 4 counts out. "We need to..." "Look." Jenny grabbed his arm, pointed ahead. A structure emerged from the forest floor. It was small, perhaps 10 feet square, constructed from weathered wood that Christopher's mind wanted to classify as a cabin or shelter, but was clearly something else. The architecture was wrong. Roof angles too steep, doorway too narrow, no windows. Shinto torii gates flanked the entrance, or approximations of them built by someone who'd seen pictures but lacked proper materials. The wood was old, decades old, maybe a century, but showed no signs of rot despite Olympic's aggressive decomposition rates. Around the structure, the ground was covered in objects. Hundreds of items, carefully arranged, rusted hairpins and combs, fragments of silk clothing now reduced to thread, ceramic bowls cracked and stained, photographs curled by moisture and time. Christopher knelt beside one photo, lifted it carefully. Black and white image, early 1900s quality, showing a young Japanese woman in traditional dress standing beside the Ho River. Her face was stern, eyes direct, posture suggesting someone who understood hardship. Behind her in the photograph, barely visible in the background, was this structure. "This is the settlement," Christopher said, his voice sounding hollow. "This is what's left of the Japanese community from 1910. But the record said they abandoned everything, left suddenly. Why would they build this?" "It's a hokora." Jenny approached the structure with visible reluctance. A small shrine, usually dedicated to kami, spirits or gods in Shinto belief. But this one, she examined the torii gates, the weathered wood. This wasn't built to honor something. Look at the construction. The gates face inward, not outward. This was built to contain something. The footprints led directly to the narrow doorway. Christopher's flashlight beam penetrated maybe 3 feet into the interior darkness before being absorbed by something that felt less like shadow and more like active negation of light. His analytical mind offered explanations: atmospheric conditions, moisture density, optical illusions created by extreme stress, but none of them felt adequate. "We can't go in there." Jenny's hand was on her Glock, though she hadn't drawn it. "Chris, every instinct I have is screaming that this is a boundary we don't cross. Megan might be in there. Or something else is." Christopher checked his watch. 4:23 p.m. They'd been off the main trail for 97 minutes. Sunset was at 5:14 p.m. this time of year. They had maybe 40 minutes of viable light remaining, and the storm was intensifying. He could hear rain hitting the canopy harder, feel temperature dropping toward hypothermic ranges. Every rational calculation said to retreat, to mark this location, to return with proper equipment and personnel and planning. But rationality had stopped applying the moment they'd found cherry blossoms in November. He stepped toward the doorway. "Chris, document this. If I don't come out in 10 minutes, leave. Mark the GPS coordinates as best you can, get back to the main trail, bring a full team." His voice was surprisingly steady. "You have family who understand this better than I do. You have context for what we're dealing with. I just have statistics that stopped making sense." Before Jenny could argue, before his courage could evaporate, Christopher crossed the threshold. The interior was larger than exterior dimensions allowed. His first thought, immediate and impossible. The structure had appeared 10 feet square, but the space inside extended at least 30 feet in multiple directions, defying geometry and common sense. His flashlight beam revealed walls covered in writing, Japanese characters carved directly into wood with manic intensity. Some were neat, deliberate, suggesting careful ritual. Others were ragged, desperate, cut deep enough to split the planks. More objects littered the floor: water-stained journals, decaying rope, fragments of clothing, and photographs. Dozens of them, all showing the same woman from different angles, different years. Christopher recognized her from the image outside. Severe expression, traditional dress, eyes that seemed to track him even through century-old emulsion. At the far end of the interior space, a well. It was perhaps 4 feet in diameter, lined with stones that gleamed with moisture despite the enclosed environment. The smell rising from it was wrong. Not the organic decay of stagnant water, but something sharper, more visceral, like ozone and copper and flowers past their bloom. Christopher approached carefully, shining his light down. The well descended beyond his beam's reach, but something moved in those depths. Not water exactly, but liquid darkness that rippled with intention rather than physics. And reflected in that surface, impossibly far below, a face looked up at him. It was Megan. She was suspended somehow in the well's throat, not falling but held, her features slack and pale and perfect. Her eyes were open but unfocused, staring at nothing. Her mouth moved soundlessly, forming words Christopher couldn't hear. And around her, the darkness wasn't empty. Shapes moved there, suggestions of other faces, other women, all trapped in that same suspended moment between falling and drowning. Christopher felt his mind fracturing, the careful barriers of rationality collapsing under weight they were never designed to bear. This couldn't exist. Wells didn't extend infinitely downward. Women didn't float in darkness without support. And yet, movement behind him. He spun, flashlight beam cutting across the interior space, illuminating what stood in the doorway. The woman from the photographs. She was there and not there simultaneously, present but translucent, wearing a white kimono that might have been burial clothing or might have been the only garment she'd possessed when she died. Her hair hung forward, black and wet, obscuring her face in the classical style of Yurei manifestations. Water dripped from her endlessly despite no visible source, forming puddles that steamed slightly in the cold air. Christopher's hand went to his Glock instinctively, muscle memory overriding rational thought. He drew the weapon, aimed at center mass, aware of how absurd the gesture was. What did bullets matter against something that cast no shadow, that existed in violation of every physical law? The woman's head tilted slightly, hair shifting enough for Christopher to glimpse the face beneath. It was ruined. Not by decay or injury, but by emotion. Features twisted into an expression of such absolute rage and grief that Christopher's nervous system recoiled from processing it. This wasn't human emotion. This was feeling calcified over decades, compressed into something that could survive death and time and the dissolution of the flesh that first experienced it. She spoke. The language was Japanese, the words incomprehensible, but meaning pierced Christopher's consciousness anyway. Not translation, but direct transmission of intent. You came seeking. Now you understand. This place remembers injustice. This ground is saturated with wrong. The women who walked here carried my story without knowing it. They became vessels for what cannot be spoken, what was buried but never resolved. What happened to you? Christopher heard himself ask, his voice cracking. Images flooded his mind, not words but compressed experience. A young woman arriving from Japan in 1909 promised marriage and new life. Finding instead exploitation, violence, men who saw her as object rather than person. Refusing to submit, fighting back, being punished. The night they held her underwater in the Ho River until her lungs filled, until consciousness fled, until the woman she'd been became the hatred she died with. Her body discarded in the river, her spirit clinging to this place, to the injustice that had consumed her last moments. The men who killed her dying one by one over the following year, accidents and illnesses, and one who simply walked into the river and never surfaced. The settlement abandoning the area, fleeing what their crime had birthed. The forest growing over evidence, time obscuring details, until only the pattern remained. Women vanishing near this trail, consumed by resonance they couldn't comprehend. They carry echoes of my story. Megan sought to remember what was forgotten. The others stumbled into memory without knowing. And I, the woman's head lifted slightly, hair shifting to reveal eyes that reflected nothing, that absorbed light like the well behind Christopher. I cannot rest while the injustice remains unspoken. I cannot release them while my story remains buried. What do you want? Christopher's training was useless here. There was no protocol for this, no framework, no statistical model. Witness. Remember. Speak what was silenced. I will. The words came automatically, a promise his conscious mind hadn't authorized. I'll document everything. I'll make sure what happened to you is recorded, acknowledged. The woman moved forward, and Christopher's perception fractured completely. She was still in the doorway, but also beside him, also reflected in the well, also standing in 12 different positions simultaneously. Her hand, if it was a hand, reached toward him, and where it passed through his chest he felt cold that burned, violation that had nothing to do with physical harm. His heart stuttered, his vision grayed at the edges, and in that moment of contact, he experienced her death directly, the water filling his lungs, the panic giving way to rage, the transition from living person to crystallized hatred, the sensation of existing beyond the body, tethered to this place by emotion too intense to dissipate. Then she withdrew, and Christopher collapsed to his knees, gasping, alive, but fundamentally altered. Chris. Jenny's voice, distant. Chris, get out of there. He crawled toward the doorway on hands that didn't feel connected to his nervous system. Behind him, the well bubbled, actual sound, physical disturbance. He glanced back once, saw Megan's suspended face opening its mouth wider, wider, impossibly wide, revealing darkness within darkness. Christopher stumbled out of the structure, fell against Jenny, let her drag him away from the Hokora. The woman in white stood in the doorway watching them retreat, her presence somehow both accusatory and resigned. We need to go. Jenny was moving, pulling Christopher with her, forcing his legs to function. Now. We need to. The forest opened for them. It simply parted, presenting a clear path back toward the main trail. Christopher's confused GPS showed coordinates that suddenly made sense again. His radio crackled to life with Marcus's voice demanding status updates. and the normal sounds of rainforest life resumed, as if they'd never stopped. They ran. Christopher's field training was 15 years old, his cardiovascular conditioning minimal after years behind a desk, but adrenaline and primal terror drove him forward. They crashed through undergrowth, splashed across streams, followed the path the forest itself seemed to be revealing until they burst onto the marked trail at mile marker 8. The arranged belongings were still there, still carefully positioned in their ritual circle. But now Christopher understood they weren't just evidence. They were offerings, acknowledgments of the pattern, tributes to something that couldn't be arrested or documented or processed through normal channels. They radioed their position, confirmed extraction, and hiked back toward the trailhead in silence. Rain intensified to the edge of torrential. Temperature dropped below 40 degrees. Christopher's wet clothing should have induced hypothermia within an hour, but he was burning from the inside out, that touch still radiating cold that wasn't cold through his chest cavity. Marcus met them at the trailhead with a medical team and questions that Christopher couldn't begin to answer. They loaded Megan's belongings into evidence bags, photographed the scene, filed reports that would circulate through bureaucratic channels without ever approaching truth. In his statement, Christopher mentioned finding the belongings arranged in a circular pattern. He described documenting the scene, following faint tracks into the undergrowth, becoming disoriented in deteriorating weather conditions. He mentioned discovering what appeared to be remains of historical settlement, possibly related to early Japanese immigrant community. He did not mention the woman in white. The well. The way Megan's face had looked suspended in darkness. The transmission of experience that his mind was already struggling to categorize as hallucination, stress response, altitude sickness, despite being at 400 feet elevation. Jenny corroborated his statement with minor variations, adding details about structural findings consistent with early 20th century construction techniques. Neither of them mentioned what they'd actually witnessed. 3 weeks passed. Christopher returned to his office, his spreadsheets, his comfortable distance from field operations. The incident report on Megan Hartley's disappearance remained open, classified as missing person with evidence of foul play. Her family held memorial services. Local news covered the story for one cycle before moving to more immediate tragedies. The pattern should have been broken, but Christopher knew better now. He'd spent 3 weeks researching Japanese immigrant history in the Olympic Peninsula, finding records that had been filed away and forgotten. In November 1910, a woman named Tomoe Matsuda had been reported missing from the Ho River area. Local doctor's journal mentioned examining her body, noting peculiarities that suggested murder rather than accidental drowning. There had been an investigation, brief, perfunctory, concluding death by misadventure. The Japanese immigrant community had dissolved within weeks, scattering to Seattle and Portland and San Francisco. And the forest had grown over everything, obscuring evidence, allowing injustice to be forgotten, until women started vanishing again, their disappearances echoing a pattern set in motion a century ago. Christopher drafted a report. Not an official document, but a comprehensive narrative detailing everything he'd found. The historical records, the contemporary disappearances, the connection between them. He included his field observations from that November day, sanitized of supernatural elements but preserving the core truth. Something unresolved existed in that section of forest. Something drawing women to specific tragedy. He submitted it to the park superintendent with a recommendation. Mark the trail section from mile 7 to 9 as hazardous. Restrict access pending further investigation. Commission a formal historical study of the 1910 immigrant settlement. The recommendation was denied. Insufficient evidence to support trail closure. Historical study deemed unnecessary given speculative nature of connections he'd drawn. The Ho River Trail remained open. Christopher stopped sleeping through the night. He'd wake at 3 a.m. to phantom sensations of water filling his lungs, of cold burning through his chest, of rage that wasn't his own saturating his consciousness. His psychiatrist adjusted his medications, recommended stress management techniques, suggested perhaps he wasn't suited for field work after all. He didn't argue, because the truth was too complicated to explain. He'd witnessed something that existed in the space between psychology and reality, where statistical analysis failed and human experience couldn't be quantified. In late December, he received an email from Jenny. Subject line: "Thought you should know." The message contained a single attachment, a newspaper article from a Seattle weekly covering Pacific Northwest folklore and urban legends. The piece discussed Japanese ghost stories, specifically Yurei traditions, and how immigrant communities had brought those beliefs to America. The author noted that certain geographic areas seemed to generate persistent reports of paranormal activity, places where tragedy and cultural memory intersected. The article mentioned the Ho River Trail, and it quoted an anonymous National Park Service analyst who'd discovered connections between contemporary disappearances and century-old unsolved deaths. The analyst had requested official investigation, but been dismissed by park administration. Christopher read the article 3 times, understanding what Jenny had done. She'd circumvented official channels, taken their experience to sources that might actually investigate rather than file away, given voice to what had been silenced. The article included contact information for the author, an invitation for anyone with information about the Ho River pattern to come forward. Christopher stared at his phone for 40 minutes before calling. The author, a freelance journalist named David Chen, no relation to Marcus, listened to Christopher's carefully sanitized account. Then he asked a single question. "Did you see her?" Christopher's carefully maintained rationality wavered. "See who?" "The woman who died there, the Onryo. Because that's what this is, isn't it? Not serial killer, not animal predation, not any explanation that fits conventional frameworks. This is a dead woman who couldn't rest, who was wronged so fundamentally that her rage outlived her body. I don't believe in ghosts." Christopher heard the lie even as he spoke it. "Neither did I," David said, "until I started researching this, until I found 6 other locations across the Pacific Northwest with similar patterns, places where immigrant communities experienced violence, where women were specifically victimized, where the deaths were covered up or dismissed. And now those locations generate persistent disappearances, always women, always following patterns that don't make statistical sense." He paused. "Mr. Reeves, I'm writing a book, documenting these sites, collecting oral histories, trying to create a record of what was deliberately forgotten. I need people willing to speak on the record about what they've experienced, people with credibility, rangers, analysts, professionals who can't be dismissed as superstitious or attention-seeking." Christopher thought about Megan suspended in that impossible well, about 5 women who'd walked into forest and never returned, about a pattern that stretched back over a century, maintained by injustice that couldn't rest. "I'll talk," he said, "on one condition. You acknowledge that these aren't just ghost stories, these are documentations of harm. Women who were victimized in life, forgotten in death, and whose stories need to be remembered not as folklore but as historical fact." "That's exactly what I'm trying to do." Christopher spent the next 3 months contributing to David's project. He provided detailed analysis of the disappearance patterns, cross-referenced historical records, helped establish connections between contemporary incidents and century-old crimes. He spoke carefully, maintaining professional distance, even while describing experiences that defied professional frameworks. The book was published in late 2009, Restless Ground: How Violence Creates Hauntings in the Pacific Northwest. It received modest attention, mostly from academic circles interested in folklore and immigrant history. Some readers dismissed it as sensationalism. Others recognized it as what Christopher had intended: witness testimony, documentation of injustices that official records had failed to preserve. Megan Hartley's family read the book. They contacted Christopher, asked questions he answered as truthfully as he could without sounding insane. They appreciated that someone had tried to understand, had refused to accept missing person as sufficient explanation. They couldn't give them closure, but he gave them acknowledgement that their daughter's disappearance was part of something larger, something that deserved investigation rather than dismissal. The Ho River Trail section from miles 7 to 9 was finally restricted in March 2010. following a sixth disappearance that generated sufficient media pressure to force administrative action. The restriction was listed as temporary pending geological assessment, the official explanation focusing on trail erosion and unstable ground rather than anything that couldn't be quantified. Christopher knew better. The restriction had nothing to do with geology and everything to do with documentation. Evidence that something wrong persisted in that forest, something that statistical analysis could gesture toward but never fully capture. He never returned to the trail. But on new moon nights, when rain hammered his apartment windows with Olympic Peninsula intensity, Christopher would wake at 3 a.m. feeling cold burning through his chest. He'd remember the woman in white, the well that descended forever, the face of Megan Hartley suspended in darkness, and he'd remember the promise he'd made. Witness. Remember. Speak what was silenced. Some promises couldn't be broken, even when keeping them meant carrying weight that statistics couldn't measure, patterns that existed beyond data's reach. The forest remembered injustice. And now, so did he. The only difference was that memory, once acknowledged, couldn't be buried again. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Megan. The Spot GPS tracker's message indicator blinked orange in the dim light of Sarah's ranger station, its cheerful beep incongruous against the November darkness pressing against the windows. She'd been filling out inventory reports, tedious work that kept her hands busy while her mind tried not to wander into the uncomfortable spaces it always found. The spaces where she sensed things, felt things that shouldn't be felt. She almost didn't check the device. Benjamin wasn't due to report for another 6 hours. The timestamp read 3:47 a.m. The coordinates placed him near Iceberg Lake, 40 miles into the boundary waters. Sarah's finger hovered over the play button, and something in her chest constricted. Not a physical sensation, but something else. Something she'd learned to recognize in the 34 years of being different. Wrong, her mother had called it. Sensitive, the therapist had said. Cursed, her Ojibwe grandmother had whispered before she died. She pressed play. Static crackled, then Benjamin's voice emerged, thin and distorted by satellite delay, and something else Sarah couldn't identify. Sarah, A gulping breath, wet and ragged. I don't know what I'm seeing. It moves wrong. The way it moves is wrong. Sarah leaned closer to the device, her skin prickling. Outside, the thermometer read -15 Fahrenheit. Inside, she felt colder. There were tracks, human tracks. But they changed, Sarah. Changed while I was following them. Boot prints became something else. Something with... His voice fractured into a sound between a sob and a laugh. I'm so hungry. God, I've never been this hungry. I ate everything I brought. 2 days of food in one sitting and I'm starving, Sarah. A sound interrupted him. Not wind. Not any animal Sarah had heard in 12 years of wilderness work. It was breathing. Ravenous, rattling breathing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It's coming back, Benjamin whispered. It wants me to follow. It keeps showing me how easy it would be, how good they would taste. The hikers I passed yesterday, I remember their names. I remember thinking about their... The transmission ended. Sarah played it again. Then again. Each time, that wrongness in her chest tightened, spread. She'd felt this before, standing in houses where violence had occurred, walking through sections of forest where the Ojibwe elders had warned her never to camp. Her grandmother had called it Manitokawin, the gift of sensing spirits. Sarah had spent most of her adult life calling it anxiety, medicating it, rationalizing it. The message had been sent 4 hours ago. She grabbed her radio. Dispatch, this is Ranger Station 7. I need to report a possible emergency situation. Boundary Waters sector. Requesting immediate SAR activation. The response came back crackling and hesitant. Station 7, we have that blizzard front moving in. Predicted whiteout conditions by 0800. Can this wait for weather clearance? Sarah looked at the GPS tracker, at Benjamin's coordinates glowing on the small screen. Negative. I have a hiker reporting signs of hypothermia and possible psychological distress. He's a friend. He wouldn't sound like that unless something was seriously wrong. A pause. Understood. You're authorized for emergency extraction. Be advised, you'll need to be out by 1400 hours or you'll be stuck there until the storm passes. That's a 3-day window minimum. Acknowledged. She didn't tell them about the hunger in Benjamin's voice, about the way he'd said taste, about the sensation crawling through her nervous system like ice water, whispering in a language she didn't speak but somehow understood. Wendigo. Sarah packed quickly, her hands moving through the familiar routine while her mind recoiled from that word. She wasn't superstitious. She was a biologist with a forestry degree. She'd taken the Boundary Waters position specifically because the isolation meant fewer people, fewer chaotic human emotions bleeding into her oversensitive nervous system. Trees didn't broadcast pain, lakes didn't scream, but her grandmother's stories had never felt like superstition. They'd felt like warnings. She loaded her pack with standard winter gear. Down sleeping bag rated to -40, MSR stove, fuel canisters, freeze-dried rations, water filtration system, first aid kit. Her Garmin GPS went into her jacket pocket alongside the spot tracker. Motorola radio clipped to her shoulder. Headlamp, spare batteries, chemical hand warmers. She added rope, her emergency bivy sack, and the orange rescue sled she'd drag if Benjamin was injured. At the last moment, she opened the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a small leather pouch her grandmother had given her. Asema, tobacco, tied with red string and blessed by an elder Sarah had never met. For when the hungry ones walk, her grandmother had said. Sarah had been 17, embarrassed by the superstition, but she'd kept it anyway. She tied it to her belt loop. The drive to the trailhead took 90 minutes through darkness and increasing snow. Sarah's truck handled the deteriorating forest roads with practiced ease, but her stomach churned. She kept the radio on, listening to weather updates. The storm system was intensifying faster than predicted. Winds gusting to 50 miles per hour. Visibility near zero. The National Weather Service had upgraded the warning to blizzard status. She should turn back. Instead, she thought about Benjamin's voice saying, "I'm so hungry," with that hollow, yearning desperation, and pressed the accelerator harder. They'd met 3 years ago when he'd gotten lost on a photography expedition, and she'd guided him back to the trailhead. He'd been embarrassed, self-deprecating, and then genuinely interested when she'd pointed out animal tracks, explained the fire succession patterns in the jack pines, showed him the beaver dam complex that had transformed the landscape over 15 years. They'd stayed in touch. He sent her his photos, stunning images of the Boundary Waters across seasons, and she sent him trail reports, told him the best spots for wildlife. He was careful, experienced now. He wouldn't sound like that unless something fundamental had broken. Sarah reached the trailhead at 5:23 a.m., parked, and checked her GPS. Benjamin's last known position, 48.1 degree N, 91.3 degree W, near the southeastern shore of Iceberg Lake. The route was brutal in good conditions, 20 miles of portages and frozen lake crossings, in approaching blizzard conditions, potentially lethal. She adjusted her pack straps, tested her snowshoes, and started walking. The forest was absolutely silent. That registered first. Not the cold, not the darkness, but the complete absence of sound. No wind in the pines, no creak of frozen branches, no distant owl calls, just the crunch of her snowshoes on the trail and her own breathing, visible in the beam of her headlamp. Sarah had never heard the Boundary Waters this quiet. 2 miles in, she found the first tracks. They emerged from the forest to her left, crossed the trail, and disappeared into deeper darkness to her right. Human tracks, boot prints, the distinctive tread of Salomon winter hikers. Size 11, maybe 12. The depth and spacing suggested someone running. Sarah crouched, playing her light across the prints. They were less than 3 hours old. the edges still sharp in the dry snow. But something about them made her scalp contract. The spacing was too regular, mechanical, and the depth varied strangely, as if the person's weight had fluctuated with each step. She followed them with her light. 10 yards into the forest, they changed. Not gradually, not with the blurred transition of someone whose gait had altered. The boot prints simply became something else, elongated, deeper, with claw marks extending from the toe impressions. The stride lengthened impossibly, each print now 10 feet from the last. Sarah stood there, her headlamp beam shaking slightly, and felt that familiar wrongness expand in her chest until she couldn't breathe properly. This was the moment where rationalization should kick in, where she should think. Animal tracks overlapping, optical illusion, trick of the shadows. Instead, she heard her grandmother's voice. The Wendigo was once human. It remembers being human. That's what makes it so hungry. It remembers what it lost, and the hunger for that lost humanity is endless. She forced herself to breathe, to think like a ranger, not like a frightened child. Benjamin had mentioned changing tracks in his message. These weren't Benjamin's prints. The tread was different, and he wore size 9. Someone else was out here. Someone else had. Sarah pulled out her spot tracker, checked Benjamin's coordinates again. Still transmitting. Still at Iceberg Lake 5 miles ahead. She should radio this in. Should report the anomalous tracks, request additional support. The radio on her shoulder hissed with static, and through it came a sound that wasn't quite words, a wet, clicking susurration that made her teeth ache. She spun, expecting to see something behind her on the trail. Nothing. Just the tunnel of darkness beyond her headlamp's reach, and the oppressive silence. She started walking faster. The next 4 miles passed in a state of heightened awareness that made Sarah's nerve endings sing. Every shadow seemed deliberately placed. Every tree trunk appeared to hide something just beyond perception. Twice she caught movement in her peripheral vision, quick loping strides that vanished when she turned her head. The temperature continued dropping. Her breath came in thick clouds that crystallized instantly on her scarf. At the first portage, a quarter-mile carry around Ensign Rapids, she found Benjamin's camp, or what remained of it. His north-face tent had been shredded from the inside, long tears in the fabric exposing the interior to the elements. The sleeping bag lay in tatters, down feathers scattered across the snow like the aftermath of a predator kill. But there was no blood, no signs of a bear attack or wolf pack, just systematic destruction, as if something had thrashed in fury. Sarah approached slowly, her headlamp illuminating the chaos. Benjamin's backpack lay open, contents strewn across the campsite. She cataloged each item automatically. Camp stove crushed flat, water bottles shattered, his camera, his expensive, beloved Canon, stomped into fragments. His food bag hung from the bare cable, empty. Every wrapper, every freeze-dried meal packet, torn open and licked clean. The food had been eaten raw. Freeze-dried meals consumed without rehydration. Nutrition bars devoured with their wrappers. Even the fuel canister for his stove had been punctured. The white gas pooled and frozen. Sarah's hands were shaking. She pulled them inside her jacket, tried to think clearly. Benjamin had eaten everything just like he'd said. But why destroy the rest? Why the frenzy? She knelt beside his camera fragments and felt something pulse through her. Not a physical sensation, but something deeper, more fundamental. An echo of emotion so raw, it made her gasp. Rage, desperation, and underneath it all, that vast, aching hunger that had colored Benjamin's voice on the transmission. "He's changing something inside her," whispered. "The hunger is changing him." "No," Sarah said aloud, her voice shocking in the silence. "Hypothermia. Confusion. He's sick and confused, and I need to find him before..." Her radio crackled. "Sarah." Benjamin's voice clear and close. "Sarah, I can smell you." She grabbed the radio, pressed transmit. "Benjamin, where are you? I'm at your camp. I'm here to help." "Help?" He laughed, and the sound was all wrong. Too high, breaking into pieces. I'm past help. I'm so far past help I can't even see it anymore. But I can see you. Thermal signature like a little sun in all this cold. Warm blood, hot and rich, and a wet sound, like swallowing. I've been trying to fight it, trying so hard. Do you know what that's like? To feel yourself disappearing? To feel something else moving into the space where you used to be? Ben, listen to me. You're experiencing severe hypothermia. It causes confusion, paranoia, hallucinations. I have warming gear, medical supplies. I can get you out. You don't understand. His voice dropped to a whisper. I met it 3 days ago, on the portage between Vera and Kekikabik. There were tracks, Ojibwe petroglyphs on the rocks there, did you know? Warnings, but I thought they were just historical artifacts. I followed the tracks, and it showed me. Showed you what? What I really am. What we all really are. Just meat and appetite pretending to be something more. The Wendigo strips away the pretending. It was a person once. Maybe lots of persons. The legends differ on that. But it remembers being human, and that memory is the worst part. It remembers, and it can never have it back. So it hungers for anything that reminds it of what it lost. Flesh, warmth, the lives of others. Sarah was moving now, following the GPS coordinates, her snowshoes eating up the trail. Where are you, Ben? Talk to me. Keep talking. I ate a squirrel yesterday, caught it and ate it raw, Sarah. I could feel its heart beating in my mouth, and it didn't satisfy anything. The hunger just got worse. I'm changing. My bones feel wrong. My thoughts feel wrong. I want... His voice cracked. I want to stop wanting. But it won't let me stop. It shows me images. The hikers from 3 days ago. Their camp. Where they'll be. How easy. Benjamin, you're not a monster. You're sick. Let me find you. Let me help. Silence. Then, I'm at the petroglyphs, where it started. I thought if I came back here, maybe I could stop it. Reverse it. But it doesn't work that way. The hunger doesn't go backward. Sarah checked her GPS. The petroglyphs site was 3/4 of a mile ahead, where the trail met the lake. She broke into a run, her pack bouncing, snowshoes slipping on the increasingly steep terrain. The trees began to thin. Ahead, the vast, frozen expanse of Kekikabik Lake stretched pale gray in her headlamp beam. The shore ice was rough, wind sculptured into jagged formations that threw grotesque shadows. And there, at the base of the cliff face where ancient hands had carved warnings into stone, stood Benjamin, or what had been Benjamin. He stood impossibly still, his back to her, wearing only thermal underwear despite the -20 temperature. His skin was gray-white, stretched too tight across bones that appeared to have elongated. His spine pressed against his skin in a ridge of vertebrae that shouldn't have been visible. When he turned, Sarah's breath stopped. His face. His face was still Benjamin's. She could see the features, the familiar line of his jaw, the shape of his eyes. But something had hollowed him out from the inside. His eyes were too large, pupils dilated until the irises were barely visible rings. His mouth hung open slightly, revealing teeth that seemed longer than they should be, yellowed and sharp. Most horrifying was his expression, desperate recognition mixed with vast, inhuman hunger. "Sarah," he said, and his voice was the one from the radio, fragmented, echoing strangely. "You shouldn't have come. I told them not to send anyone. I destroyed my spot transmitter. But I couldn't stop sending messages. Part of me still wants to be saved. That's the cruelest part. The human part, screaming inside while the rest transforms into appetite." Sarah forced herself to step closer, even as every instinct shrieked at her to run. "Ben, we're getting you out. I have warming blankets, I have food." "Food?" He laughed, and the sound echoed across the frozen lake like breaking glass. "I ate 3 days' worth of rations in one meal. I ate raw squirrel, raw fish from an ice fishing hole. I shattered the ice with my hands, Sarah, and I didn't even feel the cold. And I'm hungrier now than when I started. The Wendigo doesn't want food. It wants completion, wholeness. It wants to fill the empty space where its humanity used to be, but nothing fills it. Nothing ever will. He took a step toward her, and Sarah saw his feet were bare, toes blackened with frostbite. No, not frostbite. Something else. The flesh was darkening, hardening, the nails yellowing into claws. It showed me the petroglyphs, Benjamin continued, his voice taking on a sing-song quality. Did you know what they say? Machi Manitou Oma Aya. Gawin Bizinda Ken. The evil spirit lives here, do not listen. But I listened. I was curious. I photographed the markings. I traced them with my fingers. And it felt me. Felt my emptiness. We all have emptiness, Sarah. You know that better than anyone. Your sensitivity. Your grandmother's warnings. You feel the holes in people, don't you? The hungry places where they pretend to be whole. Sarah's hand went to the leather pouch at her belt. The elders have protections, ceremonies, tobacco offerings and sage smoke. Benjamin's laugh was sharp. I tried. I burned all my notebook paper, tried to make prayers, but I've already been marked. The moment I touched those stones with wanting in my heart, wanting the perfect photograph, wanting validation, wanting anything, it found purchase. The Wendigo feeds on want, on the endless human need for more. He was closer now, close enough that Sarah could smell him. Not decay exactly, but something sharp and chemical, like ammonia mixed with metal. His eyes tracked her with predatory focus, and she realized with horror that he wasn't blinking. Ben, please. I'm trying to warn you, Sarah. I'm using every remaining piece of my will to warn you instead of... His body convulsed, spine arching. Run. Run before I stop being able to choose, before it's just hunger and you're just meat and nothing else matters. Sarah pulled out the leather pouch, hands shaking, and opened it. The tobacco inside had been blessed, her grandmother said, by an elder who knew the old ways. She scattered it between herself and Benjamin, whispered the only Ojibwe words she remembered. Gichi Manidu, Ganaweni Mission. Great Spirit, protect me. Benjamin stared at the tobacco on the snow. For a moment, one impossible, hope-filled moment, something human flickered across his face. Recognition, sorrow. Then his expression emptied completely. Too late, he whispered. Oh, Sarah, it's too late. The hunger is all there is now. He moved. Not running, not leaping. He simply was 10 feet away, and then was directly in front of her, faster than her eyes could track. His hand, gray, with 2 long fingers, closed around her wrist. The touch was ice-cold and impossibly strong. Sarah looked into his eyes and felt it. The hunger. Not physical appetite, but existential void. The emptiness at the heart of human consciousness, when all the pretenses are stripped away. The screaming need for meaning in a meaningless universe. The desperation for wholeness in a broken world. The Wendigo wasn't supernatural. The Wendigo was truth. The terrible truth that humans are just hunger and void pretending to be something more. And the pretending never works, never satisfies, never fills the aching emptiness. She felt that emptiness in herself, the sensitivity that made her feel too much, the isolation she chose because people hurt, the fear that she was broken, wrong, cursed. All the years of hunger for normalcy, for peace, for the ability to just be without feeling everything, everyone, all the time. Benjamin's other hand came up, fingers extended toward her throat. I'm so hungry, he whispered. And you're so warm, so alive. If I consume that, maybe I'll feel alive again. Maybe I'll remember what it's like. Maybe. Sarah's free hand closed around her bear spray canister. Not standard issue, but something every ranger carried. She thumbed the safety off and sprayed directly into Benjamin's face at point-blank range. He didn't even flinch. Past pain, he said almost sadly. Past everything physical. The Wendigo doesn't feel anymore, it only wants. His grip tightened on her wrist, and Sarah felt bones grind together. She gasped, dropped to one knee, and felt something in her jacket pocket press against her ribs. The spot GPS tracker. The one with Benjamin's coordinates still pulsing. An idea crystallized through the panic. Insane. Desperate. Probably useless. "Ben," she gasped. "The GPS. You're still transmitting, still leaving a trail. Some part of you is still fighting, still trying to be found. That's not the Wendigo, that's you." His fingers loosened slightly. "What?" "You destroyed your spot transmitter, you said. But mine is still broadcasting. Which means rescue knows where we are. Which means they're coming. And if there's even a fragment of you still in there, still human, then you don't want them to find what you've become." It was a gamble. A lie. Dispatch thought she was executing a simple extraction, nothing more. But Sarah felt the shift in Benjamin's grip, saw something flicker in those two large eyes. "They're coming," she pressed. "Right now. And if they find you like this, if they see what you've become, that will be your legacy." Benjamin Chen, the photographer who became a monster. "Is that what you want them to remember?" "I don't want to be remembered," Benjamin said, but his voice cracked. "I don't want this. I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to take pictures. I just wanted to capture something beautiful." "Then let me go, walk away. Go deep enough into the wilderness that the Wendigo curse burns out. The elders say it can't sustain itself. The hunger eventually consumes the host. But if you do this, if you kill me, you'll be lost completely. You'll be nothing but appetite." It was the wrong thing to say. She knew it instantly. Benjamin's face contorted, and the last traces of humanity vanished behind that terrible hunger. "Appetite is all I am," he said. "All any of us are. The Wendigo just makes it honest." But his grip released. Sarah stumbled backward, cradling her injured wrist, not understanding. Benjamin stood motionless, trembling, his entire body locked in some internal war. His mouth moved wordlessly. His hands clenched and unclenched. "Go," he finally managed. "Go now. While I can still." Sarah didn't wait. She turned and ran, her snowshoes sliding on the ice, her injured wrist blazing with pain. Behind her, she heard Benjamin make a sound. Not human, not animal, but something in between. A howl of rage and grief and endless, infinite hunger. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs went numb and the cold bit through her gear. She ran until the trees closed around her and the lake disappeared behind curtains of snow. The blizzard had arrived, wind screaming through the pines, visibility dropping to nothing. She shouldn't have been able to find the trail, shouldn't have been able to navigate in whiteout conditions. But that wrongness in her chest, that sensitivity she'd spent her whole life trying to suppress, guided her. She could feel the trail like a thread through chaos, could sense the direction of safety even when she couldn't see 3 feet ahead. It took 6 hours to reach the trailhead. 6 hours of stumbling through driving snow, her body moving on pure survival instinct while her mind replayed Benjamin's transformation. His face, his hunger, the terrible recognition that the Wendigo wasn't external, it was internal. The emptiness made manifest. Her truck started on the 3rd try. She cranked the heat and sat there shaking, her injured wrist swelling, her mind fracturing. She should radio dispatch, should report what happened. What would she say? That Benjamin had transformed into a mythological monster? That she'd left him to die in the wilderness? That some part of him was still human enough to let her go, but not human enough to save? Sarah pulled out her phone. Miraculously, she had 1 bar of service. She opened her photos, scrolled to the pictures Benjamin had sent her over the years. Stunning landscapes. Wildlife captured in perfect golden hour light. The beauty of the boundary waters rendered in pixels and data. The last photo he'd sent was from a week ago, the petroglyphs on Iceberg Lake. She zoomed in, studying the ancient markings. Machi Manitou Oma Aya, Gawin Bizindakan. The evil spirit lives here. Do not listen. But humans always listened, always touched, always wanted. Sarah deleted the photo, then, methodically, deleted every message Benjamin had ever sent, cleared her call history, erased the evidence of their friendship. She would report that she'd found his destroyed campsite but no sign of him, that the blizzard had forced her to abort the search, that Benjamin Chen was lost to the boundary waters, another tragedy in an unforgiving wilderness. It was a lie, but it was kinder than the truth. She drove south through the storm, her truck's heater blasting, and tried not to feel the wrongness in her chest expanding, tried not to acknowledge what she knew, that she'd felt Benjamin's hunger because she recognized it, the emptiness, the yearning for wholeness, the desperate human need for meaning that could never be satisfied. The Wendigo didn't create hunger. It revealed it, made it honest, stripped away all the pretenses and stories humans told themselves about being more than appetite, more than void. Sarah drove for 3 hours before pulling over at a rest stop. She sat in the truck with the engine idling, staring at her injured wrist. The bruising was already spectacular, deep purple and black, but what bothered her more was the cold. Despite the heater, despite her winter gear, she felt cold from the inside out, and hungry. She'd packed energy bars, eaten nothing since breakfast. She opened one, took a bite, chewed mechanically. It tasted like cardboard. She ate another, then another. 3 bars, one after another, and the hunger didn't diminish. Her hands were shaking. No, Sarah thought. No, that's just adrenaline. Shock, trauma, not. Her phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number. Report filed. Search and rescue notified. Storm clearing expected in 72 hours. Ground search will resume after weather passes. Sarah stared at the message. She should be relieved, should be planning her official statement, coordinating with SAR teams, doing her job. Instead, she thought about Benjamin standing on the frozen lake, his body transforming, his humanity slipping away like sand through fingers. She thought about his voice. Appetite is all I am, all any of us are. Her grandmother's voice echoed. The Wendigo was once human. It remembers being human. That's what makes it so hungry. Sarah looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her eyes looked too large in her pale face. Her lips were cracked from the cold, and when she met her own gaze, she felt it, that same recognition she'd seen in Benjamin's eyes. The emptiness, the hunger, the terrible knowledge that she'd always been hungry, always been empty, and all her sensitivity, all her careful construction of isolation and routine, was just another way of pretending the void wasn't there. She started the truck and drove home, filed her report, answered questions from SAR coordinators, played the role of the diligent ranger who'd done everything possible. But at night, alone in her cabin, she felt it growing. Not transformation, nothing so dramatic, just awareness. The awareness that she'd touched something on that frozen lake, and it had touched her back. That Benjamin's hunger had recognized her hunger. That the Wendigo didn't need to bite or infect or curse. It only needed to show you the truth. And once you'd seen it, once you'd felt the emptiness at your core, the hunger that no amount of food or love or meaning could ever satisfy, you couldn't unsee it, couldn't unfeel it. Sarah stopped eating after 3 days, not intentionally. Food just became tasteless, irrelevant. She knew she should be worried, should see a doctor, should talk to someone. Instead, she requested a transfer deeper into the boundary waters, more remote, more isolated, where the emptiness was honest, where human pretenses didn't exist, where the Wendigo walked and whispered truths that civilization spent millennia trying to forget. Her transfer was approved within a week. On her last night in the southern station, Sarah stood outside and looked north toward Kekakabik Lake. The blizzard had passed. The stars were crystalline in the freezing air. And somewhere in that vast wilderness, Benjamin walked, or what remained of Benjamin, still hungry, still remembering what it meant to be human, still unable to return. Sarah felt the tobacco pouch at her belt, her grandmother's protection. She untied it, held it in her palm. The blessing felt distant now, irrelevant. Protection only mattered if you still believed there was something worth protecting. She scattered the tobacco into the wind and went inside to pack. The hunger followed. It always would. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Sarah.